Bonjour, hello, welcome everyone to the National Biodiversity Symposium toward the 2030 Biodiversity Strategy for Canada. My name is Martin Lajoie. I will be your MC for today's event. I'm the Director of National Biodiversity Policy at the Canadian Wildlife Service at Environment and Climate Change Canada. L'événement d'aujourd'hui est bilingue et vous pourrez suivre l'événement en anglais ou en français.
You will be able to follow along today in English or French, so I encourage you to look below your screen. You will see a language selection button. You will see a globe, and you can select that to enable you to choose your language preference if you require translation.
Bilingual, and you are able to follow the event in English or in French. At the bottom of your screen, there's a language button. Look for the globe logo that enables you to listen in French or in English if you require translations and interpretation. To open the symposium, I'd like to invite Grandmother Irene to the floor to provide us with some opening remarks. Over to you, Grandmother Irene. I think you're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Yes, it's my honor to be here to open your gathering today. And so before we start, we always do a smudge. And why we smudge is so that we can cleanse ourselves before we invite those ancestors in. And the smoke from the sage is our way of cleansing ourselves. So as you can see, I just lit the medicines, and you can see that a lot of those ancestors really want to visit today. Oh, all right. So we're going to cleanse our minds so that we'll have clarity and understanding. We're going to cleanse our ears so that we will listen with intent. We're going to cleanse our eyes so that we can see a good future for all the work we're going to be doing. And we're going to cleanse our mouth so that we be respectful to say good things to one another. And we make that connection from our heart to our Creator. And I like to cleanse my tummy because that's where all your emotions sit. And we just want to take any scattered emotions and we just want to ground ourselves to Mother Earth so that we can be truly present for one another. So I'm going to do 4 honor beats, and we're going to do a welcome song in Ojibwe. And we're going to travel around that medicine wheel, and I'll guide you in that song. So this is the heartbeat. And I like to think about my ancestors coming through that eastern doorway and settling themselves into our gathering. So I encourage you to think of your own ancestors because they are your helpers on your earth walk. And how we say welcome in Ojibwe is Windigan. Windigan misho misak, Windigan ok misak, Windigan naki wagama, hey ya ho. So we're gonna dance them in. Hey ya ho. Hey ya ho. Hey ya ho. Hey ya ho. In that southern direction, we're going to pray for our youth. We're going to pray for their well-being, their leadership, and their confidence, because they are the leaders of the next 7 generations. Bindagan Mishomisak, Bindagan Okamisak, Bindagan Naki Wagama, hey ya ho. Hey ya ho. Hey ya ho. Hey ya ho. And in that western direction, we're going to ask the spirit of the bear to be with us. And that bear represents courage. And that bear protects the vulnerable and stands up for what they believe in. So let's invite that bear in. Bindagan Mishon Misak, Bindagan no Kamisak, Bindagan Naki Wagama, Wahea Hea Hea Ho. 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 All right, this is our last round. And again, I ask you to think about your ancestors. You know who they are. Let's invite them in. Let's sing them in. Bindagan Misho Misak, Bindagan no Kamisak, Bindagan Naki Wagaba, Wahea Hea Hea Ho. 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 Oh, Jimmy quits, everybody. Back to you, Martin.
Thank you, grandmother Irene. Au cours des 4 prochaines heures, nous accueillerons
Next 4 hours, we will hear from excellent speakers, among others, Minister Guilbeault, Aboriginal leaders, and guardians of the biodiversity from the private sector, from schools of higher education, and various members of different levels of government in Canada.
To complete as you will see, we are curious to hear about where you're joining us from which province or territory you're here today. Looking forward to seeing you where everyone's located. Today's event launches the engagement process on the development of Canada's 2030 biodiversity strategy and supports implementation of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This framework was agreed to last December at the 15th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal. Nous avons prévu 3 panels avec des leaders sur les questions sur la biodiversité.
Dealing with biodiversity today to help us move forward as a society, and we can stop the loss of biodiversity. In that regard, we encourage you to use the chat function to pose your questions to the panel members. We also encourage you to put forward your ideas so that they can be implemented in our strategy and we can be shared during this symposium. Welcome to all comments in English and French.
You all know, and that does not need any introduction, the Honorable Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Canada, to provide some opening remarks and participate in a short questions and answer sessions. Monsieur le Ministre, à vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Martin, and
special Minister. Merci
for sharing your eloquence, wisdom, and inspiration. Let me begin by acknowledging that we are meeting today, or at least I am joining you from Montreal, or Jojega, the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Haga Nation, a long-established gathering place for many First Nation peoples. I'd like to recognize that we are all coming together from across Canada in person and virtually with a common purpose and with respect and gratitude for the land that we share. Trop longtemps, les humains ont tenu le mode naturel pour acquis, en ignorant l'importance.
Mankind has taken for granted his environment. Our security, our economy, our survival depends on healthy ecosystems restored. That nature offers us the air we breathe, the water we drink. We especially need fertile ground for the food we need. We need to counter climate change. Half of all carbon emissions are from human activity. All of that is in peril. We need to quickly face this tipping point, the loss of biodiversity, pollution, and climate change. On a global level, the decline of species is accelerating in an unprecedented fashion. We are witnessing a dangerous decline of nature, and mankind is the reason. In Canada, we have more of the forests and environment than other countries. As the minister, it's important for me that Canada must act to protect its territory and to encourage conservation on the globe. In '92, Canada was the first country to ratify the UN biodiversity. In fact, the secretariat for this convention is here in Montreal, and Canada welcomed the 15th conference, COP15. I am not very good to give compliments, even though it is my job to share with you progress. I am proud of Canada's work in COP15 and in the work for biodiversity. Let me recognize the important work of our public service members. COP15 showed us that we are lucky to have such experts working for us. Ambitious objectives were set. These tools are crafted to counter loss of biodiversity. This is an important work. The federal government and also provinces need to work in concert to this. Quebec, Montreal, and Aboriginal groups, civil society, unions, and businesses. In this framework of COP15, 196 countries have adopted an ambitious plan on how to contribute to stop the biodiversity loss and achieve our goals of 2030 and to reestablish the nature loss between now and 2050. The framework set out in Montreal is ambitious to restore ecosystems, to protect species at risk, and necessary financing was put in place to achieve our goals. Canada has also participated to recognize the explicit right and the roles of Aboriginal people, Indigenous people. And the Prime Minister underscored this, notably $800 million funding for initiatives led by Indigenous groups. We also announced an accord between Canada and Yukon aimed to advance conservation in the territory. $20 million were invested by Canada to sustain Indigenous leadership in Yukon. We are looking to increase the protection of habitats for species at risk. We are currently negotiating other agreements with other provinces and territories. Friends, this work must be a work in concert with all partners, with territories, provinces, and Indigenous groups. All these initiatives rely on important investments that our government has put forward to preserve our natural heritage. $2.3 million over 5 years aimed to protect our territories between now and 2025 towards the goal of 2030. An investment in $1.7 million was also invested, and a further $5 million aimed for climate change solutions to protect forests and prairies, humid habitats, and their management. All these efforts are starting to bear fruit. We can see progress. In 2015, only 1% of territory of ocean were protected. Today, we're more at 14%. And overall, 14% of Canada is now protected. It's a good start, but we need to do more than simply double these percentages between now and our target date. This is an important challenge. I hope that we will work towards this together. We need to work even harder. Protection, conservation, and restoration of biodiversity need to be at the heart of this process. Let's agree about one thing. The federal government cannot alone undertake this challenge. All sectors of society need to join in this work. We will all benefit from healthy ecosystems. Conservation will make Canada more resilient. That is why I am preferring to use partnerships, private sector, Indigenous groups, and all these partnerships will help to assure biodiversity. The challenge now is to coordinate all these efforts, to establish our priorities and identify possibilities, to answer those challenges, and to put forth a strategy for success. We need to be participative and inclusive. We need a pan-governmental approach. All parts of Canadian society need to participate in this planning and execution.
Biodiversity. We have today different points of view, experiences and expertise from all corners of the country. But we want our approach to be exclusive so that as many Canadians from all over the country can participate. Today, I announced the publication of a discussion document on the national strategy for 2030 for biodiversity in Canada. I invite all Canadians to express their priority in terms of biodiversity and conservation by answering an online survey. Le document ne se veut pas exhaustif. Son objectif, c'est de mieux présenter
all-encompassing. It simply sets out some of the principles that are at play involved in the protection of biodiversity. This survey will be available for 2 months.
Your priorities, your point of view, which will inform the future of biodiversity in Canada. To ensure we access as much of that capacity as possible, earlier today, I announced a release of a discussion paper entitled Towards a 2030 Biodiversity Strategy for Canada. While it's not exhaustive, the discussion paper will help Canadians familiarize themselves with some of the key issues and challenges, as well as the opportunities involved in protecting biodiversity. The survey will be available for 2 months, and I look forward to receiving the views of Canadians as they help to shape the future for biodiversity in Canada. Nous avons la conviction, les outils, l'expertise et la volonté.
The will and the skills to undertake this work. Let's do it. Allons-y. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you for taking the time to sharing with us your very important point of view on these questions. There are questions from participants, as we expected. I invite participants to use the question and answer in the chat to submit
any questions that you'd like to bring forward. Also want to apologize. We seem that we're having an issue with the polling questions, and understand that the team is working on fixing that issue at the moment. So first question, Minister, thank you for your opening, Minister. In the context of nature positive outcomes, considering that economic policies, investments, and activities remain heavily skewed towards nature and climate negative outcomes, would you support the transformation of the underlying purpose of our economic system in order to align with the expressed nature positive goals? So what do you feel we might need to do to move beyond? So over to you, Minister.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for the question. I mean, many of you would probably remember the time where not so long ago in our history, scholars and certainly economists talked about externalities, those things that happen when we destroyed the environment and that weren't taken into account as part of our economic measuring tools like GDP. And I think what we're seeing right now globally is a transformation to move away from that, to have a better understanding of what the impacts are on our environment from our activities, with the use of tools like carbon pricing, like getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. And as many of you would know, one of the targets of the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework is to eliminate subsidies that are harmful to nature, and we estimate that those are in the order of $500 billion per year. That may sound like a very daunting task, but we know how to do that because we've been working for some years to do it for fossil fuels. And in fact, there was a recent report by the international NGO Oil Change International that measured the progress made by different G7 countries. It was published just a few days before the Environment and Climate Change Ministers meeting of the G7 in Japan. And the report shows that we're not quite there yet when it comes to fossil fuel subsidies, but Canada is ahead of the pack of all G7 countries. So we've been working with the department and with finance, as well as with many civil society organizations, to better understand how we remove subsidies that are harmful to the climate. We need to do the same thing when it comes to nature. And I think we have more and more tools to be able to do that, but we need to do it very quickly.
Thank you very much. Une autre question, Monsieur le Ministre, comment est-ce que le Canada peut se positionner en tant que leader?
Position itself as a leader in conservation and biodiversity. I think that we are in catch-up mode. In 2015, there was maybe 1% of our shores and oceans which were protected. Now we're about at 15%. It's a symptom that we are serious. We're not at 30% yet, but in 7 years, we've gone from 1 to 15%. So we need to continue that work and on other habitats. So I think that preaching by example is one way of showing how we invest in restoration in nature, reforestation. It's certainly one way of accomplishing this. The other way, well, maybe I'll give you 2 more examples. For example, welcoming the COP15 here, showing that we were serious about working with international partners. We only had a few months, 5 months, barely, to organize that conference. Usually it takes 2 years to prepare that kind of conference. Well, we needed to work very closely with China, which is not obvious these days. And the last example I would give you is the work that we're starting together today. We're one of the first countries following COP15 to launch national consultations for an action plan. And as I also a framework for the protection of biodiversity that's going to come and structure our objectives and impose on the government a number of exercises, transparency, and also consultation. Thank you. Other questions that are trickling in? Again, I encourage you to use the chat function.
To submit questions for the minister. A new one that came in. How will the federal government invest in the growing of native plants and seeds to ensure that restoration targets can be met? The current supply of native seeds and plants does not meet the demand. we can't hit ambitious restoration targets without a reliable supply of genetically appropriate plant materials. So thinking about, it's a bit of a question and a comment at the same time, thinking of restorations goal as part of the GBF. I wonder if, Minister, if you could comment on this.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. As I said in my remarks, for us, it's very clear as a federal government that there is no path to protecting at least 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030, working on restoring at least 30% of degraded lands without relying on the knowledge, expertise, and experience of Indigenous people, which is why our government is contributing historic amounts to Indigenous-led conservations in Canada. The announcement of the $800 million for PFPs during COP15 was certainly an example, but also initiatives like the Guardians program, the Indigenous Guardians program, which is an initiative, a partnership, I would call it, between the federal government and Indigenous peoples all across the country to support conservation projects in communities, in Indigenous communities, and not projects where the federal government is telling those communities what they should be doing, but the other way around. We're funding right now more than 1,000 Indigenous guardians in the country, and I think this number will only keep on growing.
Another question that came in from our audience: how will the Biodiversity Action Plan or the strategy intersect with critical initiatives in agriculture, forestry, and other landscapes?
That is also a good question. We have launched already initiatives like our goal to plant 2 billion trees by 2030, which is accelerate. 2 years ago, we planted about, well, we didn't, the federal government, we didn't plant them, but in partnership with many of you, in fact, and others across the country, we facilitate the plantation of about 30 million trees in 2021, about 60 millions in 2022. We have to get to a cruising altitude of 300 millions per year to reach our goals of planting 2 billions by 2030, and we need to get there in the coming years. So we're making progress, but we're still not where we need to be. So we're looking to create more partnerships. But I think that the work we're doing today with the symposium and the consultations is how can we pull different initiatives that the federal government is doing, or look into different, it's not just about what Environment and Climate Change Canada is doing, it's a whole of government approach. So what do you think the Department of Finance should contribute, and natural resources and transportation? And then from there, we will build a plan and legislation that looks at how we as a nation, not just one department, but we as a nation can achieve those ambitious goals that we set for ourselves during the conference in Montreal.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Perhaps a good segue for the next question. What role can Indigenous-led action play in meeting our biodiversity targets?
Well, I think I talked about it a little bit earlier, but there is no, going forward, any new conservation projects will have to have Indigenous peoples at the table as equal partners as the federal government and provinces, when provinces are implicated, or municipalities or the private sector. In fact, for example, the commitment we made during the last campaign to create 50 new national urban parks, well, for each of these initiatives, local Indigenous peoples for each of the projects need to be at the table for the elaboration of the project. Same thing with Indigenous protected and conserved areas, IPCAs. We're now in the process of, for any new conservation, large conservation project or small conservation project, we're making sure that the Indigenous peoples are at the table with us. We're moving into benefit sharing agreements for the management of some of our existing national parks. So I think it's a very new approach we're taking in Canada.
Prochaine question en français, Monsieur le Ministre. À quel moment prévoyez-vous être en mesure de renverser?
When are you planning on being able to revert the tendency, so to demonstrate yearly that the green gas emissions are releasing, that biodiversity is recovering and that species are doing better? So in terms of greenhouse gases, the national inventory of emissions that was published a few weeks ago contains good news and some challenges, of course, but some good news, because from 2019 to 2021, we were able to reduce the greenhouse gases by 50 million tons, which represents about half of the emissions of all of Quebec. Quebec releases about 80 million tons a year. So it's like if we took from the 11 million vehicles out of the road, and in 2020, 2021, Canada has the best results in all of the G7 countries in terms of greenhouse gases emissions. So it takes a long time to compile all the data, but in 2021, we were already at 25% of our goals from 2030. So we still have 9 years to the rest of the way. So we did some, there were some improvements, you know, in 2015, the sky was the limit for greenhouse emissions, greenhouse gases. No, we have been able to flatten the curve and not reduce the curves. So in terms of biodiversity, the goals of the Kunming agreements in Montreal is that by 2050, collectively, we should have put a brake on the loss of biodiversity. And as you know, every year we have a negative result in terms of our natural heritage. The goal is that starting in 2050, we're supposed to have a positive outcome from year to year. There should be more biodiversity from one year to the other. So we have 25 years ahead of us to accomplish that, to give us up to 2030 to put a brake to the loss of biodiversity. Then we give ourselves another 20 years to revert the tendency.
Merci. Il y a plusieurs commentaires, questions sur le travail nécessaire avec les provinces et les territoires.
So we have a lot of questions on the work together with provinces.
Working with provinces and territories to achieve biodiversity targets.
Well, that's an area where we need many of you to work with us. Whether you're with an indigenous nations and environmental organizations, a community group, it needs to be not a federal action plan. It needs to be a national action plan. I mean, obviously the legislation will be federal, but we need the buy-in of all provinces and territories. And I can tell you right now, it's not the case. We have very good working relationship with some of the province and territories, but in not all of them. Some of them have told me very clearly that they weren't interested in working with us on achieving those goals. So that's where we will need you to help us and to work with us to ensure that everyone steps up to the plate, not just some, not just a handful, not just the most committed, but all provinces and territories.
Merci pour ceci. Prochaine question liée à la science.
Question is a scientific question.
How do you see science play a role in the strategy?
Science, and we have some of our scientists on the symposium with us, not from Environment and Climate Change Canada, but I know as well from civil society organizations, academics, and so on and so forth. It is essential. The 30%, the so-called 30 by 30, is not a number that countries picked out of a hat. It's a number out of a very important report by the the group of scientists that advises the conservation nations through the global biodiversity framework that came out a few years ago that said that 30% is a minimum. That's why I say at least. So it's not a ceiling, it's a floor, and that's what's needed to help nature starts to regenerate, to regain what we have caused it to lose over the decades. So it's not a maximum, it's a minimum. And science keeps informing the actions we have to make on government, whether it's on nature, climate change, fighting plastic pollution. Science is an essential element of our action.
Next question, Minister, you said legislation is a critical part of the plan to meet the goals. Can you comment on the legislation and timelines?
Yes, thank you. So what I said towards the tail end of COP15, and which I've reiterated a few times since publicly, is that we have a Climate Accountability Act that was adopted 3 years ago that guides what we do on climate change. The emissions, the emissions reduction plan that I presented last year, so-called ERP, which showed what should be the contribution of every sector of Canadian of the Canadian society to ensure that we achieve our 2030 targets, which define which measures, whether they're legislative measures, regulatory measures, investments, fiscal measures like carbon pricing. So everything that the plan that the government was doing, and other things that the government planned on doing. The accountability and transparency that the Climate Accountability Act imposes on the federal government, our government, and future governments as well, is an essential component of our climate change strategy. And I think we need that for nature. We need a Nature Accountability Act. My team and I and the department have started working on it. We're hoping to be able to table legislation by the end of the year, beginning of 2024 at the latest, so that we want to go to COP16, which will be at the end of 2024 in Turkey, with an adopted bill on nature accountability. And there's a handful of countries in the world that are working on this now. To my knowledge, none have adopted it as of yet. So we would be one of the first. We may not be the first country to do it, but we will be one of the first. And we're working with a number of countries who want to pull their ideas, knowledge, experience together to do it. So we want to create an international coalition of countries who will call upon their peers to do the same.
Excellent. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Merci
for taking time to talk to us this morning.
Is on your schedule. You're a very, very busy man. But I just wanted to share our sincere thanks for joining us this morning at this important moment, as we will continue our consultation with Canadian. Just wonder if you have a few last words before we have to let you go.
Merci beaucoup, Martin, et puis merci à tout le monde qui participe.
And thank you to everyone who's taking part in this symposium, important symposium today. Well, here in
who's here today, and those who will participate who are participating in the symposium, but who will also participate in the consultations in the coming months. This is a very important and meaningful exercise for us as the Government of Canada, and I want to thank you again for participating. Merci beaucoup. Bonne journée.
Merci encore une fois. Excellent. Alors, maintenant, je vais inviter...
now,
le sondage est réapparu.
oh, the poll is back on the screen. We're wondering if the technical issues were resolved. I'll get back to you soon. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm very happy to invite Tara Shannon, who is
to speak to us on what to expect in the coming months with regards to Canada's 2030 biodiversity strategy and upcoming international work. Tara, over to you.
Merci Martin, merci Grandmother Irene.
Grand-mère Irene, ministre Guilbeault, et encore une fois,
the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. Very pleased to be here today. And I think through my remarks, you will hear that I'm reiterating a lot of what the minister just shared with all of us. So thank you again, Minister Guilbeault, for setting the stage for today's symposium. As the minister pointed out in his open remarks, we reached a monumental agreement in Montreal last December. That followed 4 years of extensive negotiations, numerous delays due to the pandemic, and after that, negotiators from around the world succeeded to agree on goals and targets and arrive at a framework that some have referred to as Nature's Paris moment. While arriving at the framework that all 196 parties could support was a challenge, as to reiterate the minister, the real work actually begins now. Canada and all other parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity must now develop domestic action plans to support the framework's underlying objective to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And this means, for us, updating our national biodiversity strategy to 2030 before COP16 in Turkey in 2024. Au niveau national, un travail considérable et un leadership
considerable effort and continued leadership are needed to implement the frame we adopted. We need your help. As the minister said, you can now, in the next 60 days, you can go online to help us help write the Biodiversity 2030 Canada. So the response to Canada to the global frame on biodiversity in Montreal.
Submit your views on a range of questions, and this will help inform the drafting of the strategy. There will also be targeted engagements over the coming months with key partners and stakeholder groups, such as Indigenous organizations in industry, youth, municipalities, environmental NGOs, and the philanthropic sector, amongst others. We will be working closely with our provincial and territorial colleagues, and we will also benefit from the work of the Nature Advisory Committee. These engagement sessions will be done both virtually and in person. We will take the feedback we receive through these engagement sessions, as well as the information we'll get from the online survey, to inform the drafting of the new biodiversity strategy for Canada. The strategy, of course, needs to be developed to reflect the diversity of Canadian perspectives. And again, I'm repeating information the minister shared, which is that we intend to take a comprehensive whole of society, whole of government approach. And this, given that no single group has all the knowledge, tools, and resources required to achieve our shared biodiversity goals. I do want to take a moment to just underline that the new framework is more measurable than past frameworks. And this will allow progress to be monitored through a combination of headline indicators and enhanced planning and reporting and review. And it will be important, therefore, for our domestic strategy to set priorities, actions, and milestones that allow us to regularly and transparently assess our progress. Quickly, looking to internationally, the work that remains ahead of us. We will continue our work with the global community to further advance the indicators to measure progress to our collective goal to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to mobilize resources from all sources to support nature's recovery, and to address complex issues like developing a mechanism to share benefits arising from the use of digital sequence information. This latter is expected to be a key focus of COP16 in Turkey in 2024. And as noted, we just released the final report showing our progress on Canada's biodiversity goals and targets between 2010 and 2020. During that decade, Canada met or partially met most of our 19 targets, but it is clear that our work is not finished. Echoing the minister, we have an ambitious task ahead to meet our 2030 goals and targets, and this is why we need to keep the momentum going. Working collaboratively to do the work needed will be key to meeting our ambition. So, in closing, mon équipe et moi sommes prêtes à travailler avec tous les partenaires dans les mois.
Work with all partners in the next months and years to stop and revert the loss of biodiversity.
And ready to work with you. I'm looking so forward to today hearing from our panelists. And pleased again that we finally found ourselves at the day where we get to launch the engagement sessions for developing our biodiversity strategy. Merci encore. Hey, back to you.
Thank you, Tara. It's obvious that we have much work to do in the coming months. Encore une fois, merci, Grandmother Irene.
Thank you, Grandmother Irene. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Tara, for the opening of.
Quite excited to know that I understand we're close to 150 participants. It's very impressive, and it's great to see so many people joining us online. And we also have people joining us directly on YouTube, where it's being streamed. So lots of interest, a lot of interest and passionate people that want to know more about this, and hopefully you all go and get engaged and look at the online platform and take the time to answer the questions that we have prepared for you, because we need your input. As I think it was mentioned, we don't pretend that we have all the answers, and then so we need your help. Understand that the polls have come in. I'm looking at the screen now, and understand that the glitch has been fixed. You can see where people are joining us from. Let me scroll down here. Great to see that we seem to have folks from coast to coast to coast with us today. And I see that our first panel, people are getting on screen. I'm sure you can appreciate, it's a lot of coordination to bring people together for all these different panels. So I think we have everyone ready to go. So let's, I also note that we are a little bit ahead of schedule, which is not a bad thing. It's usually the opposite. And then so perhaps the first panel will get the chance to have a few more minutes to discuss these important issues. Nous avons maintenant l'honneur de commencer
honor to begin with the first roundtable, the third panel on the reducing threats on biodiversity. I'm going to ask Valérie Courtois to chair this panel. Valérie is the executive director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. She is very active on conservation and biodiversity conservation issues. Valérie,
first, I'd like
you have the floor.
Sincere thank you to Elder Grandmother Irene for that wonderful opening and starting us off in the right way. Merci aussi au ministre Guilbeault. Tara, thank you very much for your words. And of course, Martin, for your wonderful moderation of this whole event. I'm joining you from Dasinan, which is the traditional word for the Innu territory, also known as Goose Bay, Labrador. And it's an honor to be here with you today. Welcome everyone to the very first panel of the National Biodiversity Symposium. As Martin introduced, I am the Executive Director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, which is the only national scope Indigenous-led conservation focused organization in Canada. Our mission is really to support and strengthen Indigenous nationhood and recognize that as people of place, we have an important leadership role to assume in terms of not only the response to biodiversity loss, but also the dual crisis of climate change, and as the minister spoke about earlier, also pollution. Halting and reversing nature loss is amongst Canada's biggest challenges, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing from the leaders in biodiversity from across what is now known as Canada on what they're doing and what more can be done to address this issue. I just have had the pleasure of hosting and being in a room of 350 guardians, leaders, and allies last week in what is now known as Ottawa, and who, you know, these guardians are on the front lines of the biodiversity crisis and responding to climate change. As the minister said, the Indigenous peoples in what is now known as Canada are very much stepping up to provide the leadership and respond to this crisis, and in fact have over 500 million square kilometers in proposed Indigenous protected and conserved areas ready to go. And so, Minister, you can count on us to being there in response to this crisis. I'm very, very excited to hear the panelists' perspectives on the greatest threats in biodiversity in Canada and across the globe, the challenges and opportunities that they're facing, and how they're collaborating with other jurisdictions, partners, and the public to implement these solutions. During these sessions, we'll have each of our panelists share their experiences, and I encourage you, the audience online, to send us your questions via Zoom, as Martin has spoke about in the Q&A function. By learning from others, we can help build these insights into Canada's own biodiversity strategy. And I look forward to this conversation demonstrating that opportunity. The first panel will feature panelists from different levels of government, federal and provincial, and the environmental non-governmental sector. I'm pleased to introduce our four panelists in alphabetical order, of course. Simon Mitchell, who is the Vice President of Resilient Habitats at WWF Canada. Welcome, Simon. Our second panelist will be David Muir. He's Assistant Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Water, Lands and Resource Stewardship for the Government of British Columbia. And I do note, David, your government's leadership on the development of the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the need to kind of align that declaration with all of this action on biodiversity and climate change response. Our third panelist is Dr. Niall O'Day, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister at the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And a special hello to Niall. We worked together on the early days of the development of the IPCA process while he was Associate Assistant Deputy Minister with Environment and Climate Change Canada. Nice to see you again, Niall. And of course, he's a fellow Newfoundland and Labradorian, so we might have a little biased here. And last, but of course not least, is Alison Woodley, a longtime friend. She is Senior Strategic Advisor for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. And of course, very, very active in these discussions, not only here domestically, but also internationally. So again, thank you everyone for joining us to be part of this important conversation. I'd now like to turn it over to each one of our panelists to share their experiences on how biodiversity has really been centered in their work. So first, I'd like to start with Simon. Over to you, Simon.
Super. Thank you so much, Val, and hello, everybody. Also, a big thanks to Grandmother Irene and Minister Guilbeault for your welcoming remarks. I'm delighted to be here today, and as Val said, my name's Simon Mitchell. I'm the Vice President, Resilient Habitats at WWF Canada, and I'm coming to you from the Wolastoq, the traditional territory of the Wolastoqiyik, also known as the Malaspite, on the St. John River in New Brunswick. So looks like we've got the East Coast covered here today, at least on this first panel. Being the first panelist, I wanted to take a bit of time to set the stage on the theme of threats as it relates to biodiversity. And as a starting point, we all know that our spirit, our culture and identity thrives in relation to lands and waters, nature, and all of the species that are an important part of this. We know there are opportunities for shared learning and the importance of traditional knowledge in both understanding the problem and implementing the solutions. The relationship between people and species, habitats and ecosystems results in a greater well-being, health, and resilience for all. Second, we know that we're in a difficult place now. The WWF Living Planet Report Canada from 2020 revealed that since 1970, populations of Canadian species assessed as at risk have plunged by an average of 59%. The threats facing species are numerous, with climate change frequently being a difficult threat to many species. Habitat loss and degradation are examples of the direct connection between biodiversity loss and climate change. Pollution, invasives and disease, transportation, and agricultural activity are a few other of the key areas that facing threats, or key threats facing species, pardon me. At-risk species in Canada face on average 5 threats, including the accelerating threat of climate change, and 87% of species monitored were impacted by more than one threat. This tells us that the problem is complex and will take a multitude of approaches to solve. The new strategy must take into account the feedback loop between healthy ecosystems and the benefits for holding on to and removing carbon in nature. It is clear that the status quo is not enough and that we need to end the biodiversity loss. So the question is, how can a new national biodiversity strategy put us on the right track? Not acting may be one of the largest threats facing this whole discussion. We need to take a more adaptive, iterative, and action-oriented path to recovering species. This will make us feel uncomfortable. It will mean that we have to learn, act, and adjust never done before. The significance of this crisis warrants all of that and then some, and I'd suggest that there are a couple of key aspects to consider here. First off, we need to halt the threats. This requires more tools and approaches, more human and financial resources, and making tough decisions. We've seen this can work. The recent discussion around Baffin land is a good example. On the other side of the coin, though, we've seen projects like Roberts Bank Terminal 2 be approved while openly acknowledging the serious threat to a number of rare species and habitats. We need clear guidance on when the environment supersedes the economy and culture. And when these projects go forward, we need the monitoring, ongoing assessment, and supporting enforcement action when issues arise. We need clear and decisive action when species at risk are involved. We need a whole of government approach to species at risk. This means federal, provincial, territorial, Indigenous, and municipal governments are involved and acting. We need a federated approach, and we know that works well from our experience with healthcare, and that it is possible to pull this off from coast to coast to coast. This is particularly challenging given the jurisdictional responsibilities as it relates to species, but is one area where co-benefits can play an important role. For starters, we should see clear acknowledgement of the biodiversity crisis, and in particular how threats such as deforestation, the destruction of peatlands, and industrial development are to be addressed in government mandate letters, something we've seen for the last number of years around the climate change file. We also need to see other federal departments and provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments contributing to the process and delivering on outcomes. Essentially, we need to have a biodiversity lens across everything government does, no matter the political stripe, the time, the jurisdictional responsibility, or the location. We need a national biodiversity strategy that takes a rights-based approach, supports Indigenous cultures, knowledge, and self-determination, and is squarely rooted in a nation-to-nation approach. We also need to understand the role of restoration can play in species recovery, the reverse of halt and reverse, if you will. Setting a national target for restoration that considers both converted and degraded lands is important, and from there we need to take action on the ground right away. This must be a multi-species approach that includes complex ecosystem restoration, and we need to build the capacity to tackle restoration across a diversity of landscapes, ownerships, while recognizing and building the capacity of our partners on the ground. Core to restoration is the importance of the role nature-based climate solutions can play, and we know that this is 1/3 of the solution on the climate file. Lastly, bending the curve on biodiversity is a shared responsibility. All of us, no matter where we are or what we do from coast to coast to coast, must step up to this challenge. We cannot be constrained by existing paradigms around land or water, since it is all connected, and we have a collective responsibility to ensure that species are here for future generations. Thank you for your time. Woolly one, all my relations. And back to you, Val.
Thank you very much, Simon, for those opening comments. Next, I'd like to invite David to join us for his opening comments. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. David Mutter, I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people here in Victoria. And thanks to my fellow panelists, this is such a wonderful opportunity to come together and talk about the discussion point of reducing threats to biodiversity. I first want to raise a thanks to the federal government for convening this forum. And it's through that I think is the most effective method of reducing threats to biodiversity. There's an old saying, if you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast, go alone. But when it comes to reducing threats to biodiversity, I think that paradox is broken. I think this is one that requires urgent action, immediate action, but it can only be done together. And through forums like this, we can build a better understanding of how to approach that. This is one that it'll be faster if we go together. And I think we need to get much more specific about where we do that work together. Simon spoke about some of this, and I've appreciated many of the reports from WWF. I think a lot of it begins with the data. There's a lot of great data nationally in British Columbia as well. Part of my ministry that I'm with here develops much of that data. What we have found is that when that data is developed together and is presented in a much more transparent manner about the status of an ecosystem, the status of value components, it's more effective, more approachable, and it builds that involvement of communities to understand the immediate challenge of threats to biodiversity. So working together, I think, begins with the data and begins with building a community level involvement in the data. Such an inclusive approach can be done at multiple levels, and much of that's in the discussion for today's session, whether that's Guardian programs, stewardship initiatives, or building just that foundational data. In British Columbia, there's a few examples that I would just like to speak about quickly where we're building this data together. The first is the Collaborative Indigenous Stewardship Framework, and this is a program in BC where we are working with over 125 different First Nations to build that foundational data in order to inform our planning going forward. There's approximately 204 First Nations in BC, so we're working with a large majority of them. And it begins right with the basis of going out on the landscape together to gather data, agreeing upon the protocol by which we'll assess an ecosystem, and then publishing that information together to inform planning. It takes a lot of time. But when the data is built together and it's presented together and it involves communities, it's much faster to take action on that. And that's the second program that I'd like to speak about, our modernized land use planning program here in BC, where we work in close partnership with First Nations title and rights holders on affecting changes in land use that's in place right now. The deep connection to the data is key. The very close partnership with First Nations is the foundational basis upon which we do this work. And there's a few dozen places in BC where we have these partnerships up and running, and we're advancing land use planning based upon that trusted data. The collaboration needs to go much further as well. First Nation governments and provincial governments in these instances need to work together on the socioeconomic impacts with community members. Increasing conservation and restoration, it does have an effect on an economy, and making those sorts of decisions together will make them more durable, will make them more long lasting. It'll involve more people to affect that change and to address that challenge. So as well, our modernized land use planning has that foundation of working in partnership with First Nations and communities to understand the socioeconomic benefits and impacts and build that plan collaboratively together going forward. So that's the theme that I think of today, and I'll leave my remarks there. This is one case where going fast is going to be going together. Thanks to the fellow panelists here, and I look forward to your questions today.
Thank you very much for those comments, David. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Niall O'Day. Over to you, Niall.
Okay, thanks, Val, and great to see you. Great to see so many familiar faces, and really appreciate the invitation to join you. I'm joining from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and here to provide, despite being in the middle of the country, a bit of the ocean perspective to the conversation here today as Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy at Fisheries and Oceans. We're really pleased to be playing a key role in this process, recognizing that while in many instances conservation efforts have a terrestrial focus, that the integration between the land and the sea and conservation in our oceans, rivers, and lakes are essential to achieving our conservation outcomes. And I'll give a little bit of a perspective on where we've had some successes in relation to working on the previous Aichi targets, and where we face or foresee some challenges moving forward, just to provide a bit of a perspective on what the threads of forward work may be. And a couple that I'd point to, one is planning. So David spoke to the need for us to move fast. We all have to work together. And marine spatial planning is one area where we are working to advance that work in 5 different geographic areas to better coordinate how we manage and use marine space to achieve ecological, economic, cultural, and social objectives. And we're committed to continuing that work with provincial partners, with Indigenous partners and stakeholders to ensure that there is that involvement early, often, and sustained throughout the process, and recognizing that those marine spatial plans are an iterative exercise in some sense. They provide us a frame through which and a governance through which to take sound decisions in this space. Another aspect is around ecosystem restoration and recognizing that that halt and reverse loss requires restoration activities. Programs like our Aquatic Ecosystems Restoration Fund have demonstrated some success in restoration activities and projects. And we have seen a further injection of $75 million over the next 5 years into supporting aquatic ecosystem restoration, really aimed at addressing some of the root causes of coastal and marine environmental loss. And we really think that's an important area of investment. Success in meeting our new biodiversity targets and developing a robust domestic plan, I think, is also going to involve thinking through at a more specific geographic level, and sometimes associated with more specific species, how we can best move forward. And here, I think the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative is an example, again, where that collaboration with Indigenous peoples, provincial and territorial governments, harvesters, stewardship partners, academia, environmentalists, and other stakeholders will be very key to managing what is a highly complex issue, and where multiple of the risk drivers for biodiversity loss are acting at once, and where they need to be tackled in a coordinated fashion. Marine conservation is another area where we've had some really great success thus far. We've managed to make our way to 14% protection of our marine and coastal areas, but where the work ahead requires similar, robust, and in fact accelerated efforts towards that goal. And part of that is around setting out a clear pathway and plan. And that's what we did seek to do at the 5th Impact Conference of the International Marine Protected Areas Congress that happened in Vancouver at the beginning of the year, really looking to map very clearly what it will take to get from 25 to 30% by 2030, and really emphasizing and putting forward the leadership that our Indigenous partners are bringing to that conversation, which I think has been so crucial to the progress we've made in both the terrestrial and in marine context thus far. Species recovery, another kind of really key element of this process, and aquatic species at risk, obviously a key focus for us. And sometimes that requires really innovative approaches. So I think North Atlantic right whale is a key example of that, where looking at how we address where and at what time one can fish and the kinds of gear one can fish with is really key, and working in partnership with industry and others to figure out how we make that work to protect those species that are facing critical risks to their survival. The species we don't want, alien invasive species, are another area of focus, and one where we do have concerted action happening, particularly with provincial territorial partners, but also Indigenous partners through the National Aquatic Invasive Species Committee. And then, of course, I wouldn't be DFO if I didn't say fishing regulations were very important to how we manage in this space moving forward. And really, the development of the Fisheries Act's fish stock provisions is aimed at making sure that we're setting targets for the recovery of those species of stocks that have become depleted in a way that helps to sustain our fisheries, both for their biodiversity benefits, but also for the contributions that they make to our sustainable livelihoods. So I think just very briefly, I would say those are some key areas of work against the threats that we have identified. As others have noted, data is a really critical piece to this, and we do need to work together on building better data integration over the course of time, working on how we develop interoperable sets of data that are built together and that give as many people as possible the tools and information needed to help inform the kind of decisions that we need to make. Collaboration is the last thing I'll say, and that has been essential to where we've gotten so far, and I think will be essential to how we move forward. And Val, to pick up on your point, the UN Declaration Act and what it requires of us as a federal government and as a partner to Indigenous governments and partners is going to be very critical to shaping how we do this work in parallel with our obligation to nations. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Niall, thank you very much. And of course, last but not least, Allison, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Val. Thanks, Val. Sorry. And thank you to Elder Irene and to, just as you said that, I lost my notes. There we go. They're back. And my voice, apparently. Sorry. Thanks, Val. Thanks, Elder Irene, and thanks, Minister Guilbeault. It's really an honor to join you here today. I am joining you from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, just north of what is now known as Ottawa. I want to start by just reinforcing what a big moment this is. And what a big opportunity that we have in front of us. And I don't think we should overestimate the moment and the importance of the moment, or squander the opportunity that we have in front of us. I had the honor of being at COP15 in Montreal and in many of the negotiating sessions in the lead up to that. And COP15 had an enormous amount of energy and momentum. I mean, it was a really inspiring event. And I really want to acknowledge Canada's leadership, both in hosting with Quebec and Montreal, COP15 in what was a tricky political situation, and also, and particularly kudos to Minister Guilbeault in landing an ambitious global deal that almost every country in the world has signed on to. This is a big deal. And we now have an opportunity to build on this momentum and to demonstrate that Canada can be a leader not only in landing an ambitious agreement, but also in implementing this on the ground, in the ocean, in a good way, stopping the collapse of nature and getting on a path to recovery by 2030. We have to do this for our sake, for our future generations' sake, for the sake of all of those species with whom we share this planet, and we can do that. We can build on what's already underway. What we're doing now isn't enough, obviously. It's biodiversity is still collapsing, but we can build on the work that's underway, working towards the protecting 30% by 2030 target, learning from some of the climate actions, as the minister alluded to, and scale up and expand action across all the targets. I do want to note that from my perspective, one of the most hopeful things coming out of Montreal is the prominence and recognition of Indigenous rights, Indigenous leadership, Indigenous ways of knowing throughout the conference and embedded throughout the framework. In Canada, as Val has alluded to, and others, Indigenous peoples are already leading the way to protecting and stewarding biodiversity on their lands and waters. And this leadership offers a path to success that needs to be fully recognized and supported and integrated in the strategy and in its implementation, aligned with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this will also contribute to reconciliation in Canada. I also want to highlight that the Global Biodiversity Framework is designed as an integrated package, 4 goals, 23 targets, and to be successful to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, it needs to be implemented as an integrated package. We can't cherry pick amongst the goals and targets, picking some, ignoring others. We have to embrace it as an integrated whole. Just as an example, target 3, which is the target focused on protecting at least 30% of land and ocean by 2030, and it's the target that CPAWS, the organization I work with, is most focused on, as it's kind of core to our mandate. It's absolutely critical because evidence shows that habitat loss is the biggest threat. So protecting habitat has to be at the heart of the solution and is absolutely key. But the reality is that even that is insufficient on its own. We need to address the threats to biodiversity across 100% of the land and ocean. So the targets, the really important targets on restoring 30% of degraded land ecosystems, on spatial planning, on planning the land and seascape so that we have a kind of a coherent approach and a proactive approach to figuring out what to protect and where we can develop invasive species, pollution. We need to embrace all of these targets. The biggest challenge that we face in getting to that point, in my view, is finding a way where there is coherence across and within all levels of government and society. The approach of just mandating environment departments and DFO and a few others to save nature, while other parts of government are still supporting activities that destroy nature, is a recipe for failure. And we have to get around that and make sure that the goal of halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030 is embedded in the mandates of all departments across governments at all levels, as Simon mentioned. It needs to be the mandate of finance departments, of forestry departments, of agricultural policies, embedded in the critical mineral strategy and infrastructure, transportation. And part of that is learning when to say no, having the political will to say no, and having halting and reversing biodiversity loss as everybody's job. And the good news is that the Global Biodiversity Framework actually recognizes this need for coherence and integration across governments, across the private sector. For example, reforming subsidies that the minister mentioned, aligning policies across governments. So we have a framework for action, and now we need to act. We can't fool ourselves. This isn't going to be easy. This kind of integrated work to align governments and sectors and break down silos is really hard. But we have a framework, we have momentum, and we have to do it. And as the minister noted, we can build on some of the things we've learned on the progress made on mainstreaming, for example, climate action across Canada or across governments. Non-government organizations like CPAWS and our colleagues from across the environmental sector are committed to helping. Canadians are hugely supportive, and I note that one thing where individual Canadians can help now is to really encourage their provincial and territorial governments to get fully on board with this mission. And we have to embrace this opportunity for fundamental change. As I mentioned at the beginning, our collective future depends on our success, and we have to do it. So let's get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I agree. Let's get on with it. And before we dive into the audience questions, because we are receiving them and I've got them on my list, I do want to acknowledge that speaking of climate change, we have a number of regions across this country that are facing some difficult evacuations and loss of property and in fact, loss of biodiversity as a result of these fires and floods. And so to my friends in Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and now the Northwest Territories with the evacuation of the Katlodici First Nation in Hay River, as well as those facing flooding incidents in British Columbia and Quebec, our thoughts and prayers are with you. And we hope that many more of these discussions will help us address the challenges of these extreme events that are in themselves threats to biodiversity loss. So without further ado, let's dive right into the first question. And to the panelists, I'm just going to ask you to kind of let me know in whatever form is appropriate for you that you're ready to answer, or please just jump in. I'm even though I grew up with an RCMP officer, I'm not a rules kind of bearing person, and so we'll just kind of roll with it if you're all right with that. So the first question: what can be done to clarify legal and policy pathways and to provide predictability that First Nations and other Indigenous communities need to embark on and accelerate the creation of new Indigenous protected and conserved areas without having to stumble over contradicting departmental mandates and policies? And in light of this, is how can we bring in effective approaches from some provinces that are attempting to do it right? Let's point to you, British Columbia, for that, and in terms of just jurisdictions that may be a little bit more resistant to recognizing the leadership of First Nations. And I note, Alison, you did discuss this idea of stumbling over contradicting departmental mandates and policies. So I'm wondering if I could turn to you first to answer that question.
Oh, darn, be careful what you say at a high level. Be expected to come up with the solutions in the details. Thanks, Val. I mean, that was a very long and complex question, but I think I'll just focus on one piece, and it doesn't answer the full question, but maybe it's a thought. You know, in Canada, I think we have a tendency to not recognize the responsibilities that all levels of government have. You know, I think that citizens have a really important role to play in encouraging all levels of government to get actively behind this collective mission. So, you know, if there's one and actively engaging with their government representatives and I'm thinking mostly at the provincial level, at the territorial level, and really pushing those jurisdictions that have been reluctant and actively engaging with them, calling your MPs or not your MPs, your MLAs or your MNAs or your MHAs, your provincial representatives or territorial representatives, your municipal officials, really actively letting them know that this is important and you expect them to get on board. And I know that's just a small piece, and I don't want to put the responsibility on individual citizens, but we can make a difference collectively. And to support Indigenous-led conservation, particularly in those areas where, and to really vote based on those where, and force governments to, or political parties to say where they stand on these issues during elections, and really putting it at the forefront. And we can make a difference that way. I do note that you know, when the previous targets of protecting 17% of land and 10% of ocean were secured, it was in an election context where civil society and individuals kind of pushed their political representatives to commit, and then we moved from there. So one aspect, and there are many, many others in terms of getting coherence, but across provincial, territorial, federal, municipal levels, citizens do have a role to play.
Thanks, Alison. Anyone else want to jump in on that question about how to reinforce First Nations roles within the provincial jurisdiction? David.
I'll offer. Yeah, thanks, Val. And first of all, thanks for starting with the easy one. Of all the challenging questions you could begin with, my goodness. But it's a really important one, and so I do really appreciate it. I think the question started with, how do you clarify legal and policy pathways? And I think the first is to acknowledge that it is at its heart a legislative challenge, that legislation needs to get updated and is going to need to be looked at to address that involvement of First Nations, of title and rights holders. And so in BC, by no means do I think the provincial government has this fully figured out, but there's some things that we're working on that I think are really helpful towards that end. The Declaration Act, as you mentioned, which is a framework, and then multiple other pieces of legislation needing to be updated as defined as a requirement within that act itself. And what it does is it creates a path for shared decision-making. It creates a path for co-management, and co-management, all forms of management where First Nations would take the full lead on management of a certain aspect. We may work in partnership. We may have reporting mechanisms where the provincial government continues to lead. And enacting those understandings in policy and in legislation, I think, is the key to the challenge. So I'd begin with acknowledging that it does need a legislative and policy drive to address that initiative.
Thank you very much, David. Niall, I saw you signal.
Yeah, maybe just to chime in briefly. I mean, just to build on what's been said, I fully agree that there are policy and legislative tools that may not yet be in our toolbox or that need to be kind of attuned to achieving the kind of outcomes we're looking for here. In the interim or in parallel, and I think, sorry, in the federal context, the UN Declaration Act, asks that we do that, and demands that we do that, in fact, which is a good thing. I think in the interim, from experience, I would say that where the will can be found, the way can be found, and so there are, I think, there's a huge variety of different legislative and policy frameworks that impact on how we plan conservation in Canada. And much of that is actually because there's has been a fair degree of historic interest among all jurisdictions in taking on that kind of work. It does yield some incompatibilities that have to be dealt with in the planning process, but often working with the individual partners who have that interest and looking at that specific geography and figuring out problem solving your way through it is the kind of fastest path to progress. And then when you really do genuinely bump up against a legislative or a policy impossibility, that tells you where you have to kind of focus your effort in that front, while providing you the space to make as much progress as you can with the tools that you do have.
See, Niall and Simon.
Yeah, just all very good comments from my fellow panelists here. But from my side, I'm thinking about a couple of things. But I think we also need to spend a bit of time bringing communities and groups and actors together to talk about this. And Val, you started off panel discussion by a brief reflection. The Guardians gathering in Ottawa last week was part of Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, conservation economy visioning exercise right here in Fredericton a number of weeks ago. And we need to continue to bring people together to talk about these subjects and these topics, and to learn from one another. Have some rapid sort of knowledge mobilization, because there are some significant capacity differences from coast to coast to coast when it comes to this topic, both at a local level and a regional level and a provincial level, and certainly helping some of the communities and others just have a broader understanding of this and the role that they can play, and so that we can collectively push forward on this and many other topics will be of critical importance.
Thank you, Simon. And I'll permit myself a bit of a moderator's addition to this question, given my expertise with our work at the ILI. I do think that one of the important things is for us to think more creatively about how things count towards the target, and create a parallel policy pathway for Indigenous and protected and conserved areas that recognize the nuance and breadth of what those tools are, which are tools that in many cases are much more kind of sophisticated than some of the kind of strict big C conservation definitions for that. And when things count, they should also be managed into the long term. This is not something that we can create and hope that in 5 years the magic next government will figure out how to continue to fund. I think we need to really think creatively and with intention, as all the panelists have talked about, on not only having these areas recognized, but what the long-term management solution is for these areas. And of course, I might be a little bit biased, but I do think the Guardians are much of that solution. And we cannot set up our young people to advance into this career. The minister spoke about 1,000 Guardians. What we need is 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 Guardians to really do a good job in managing nature across this country. And it means setting up people for the right way to and a surety in that career pathway to ensure that we maximize the benefits and hopefully in many ways defer costs in other programs such as social services, etc. So Allison, I saw you
Val,
go.
can I just, jump in and I build on these great comments. I mean, the environmental community has been pushing for several years now for long-term funding. Like there's been a huge investment made by this government and it's much appreciated. It's scaled up over what we've ever seen before, but it still is short-term. And so at all levels, we need long-term funding, as you say, not only for manage, but to enable communities to make those decisions about long-term land use and ocean use in a way where they have confidence that there will be support in the long run. So that's totally key. The other point I wanted to make is we started these conversations with federal, provincial, territorial governments, with Indigenous peoples at the table, with NGOs at the table around the pathway to Canada Target 1. And that we need to find a way to continue building on Simon's point to continue those conversations. They seem to have dropped off in the last few years. And so getting those focused conversations where we can make that progress and kind of wrestle with some of these really tricky questions is really key. And I think there are some pathways that have already been kind of started that we can build on again.
And just a quick question associated to this kind of provincial, territorial, federal dynamic. There are some provinces that are really embracing the targets, that have negotiated bilateral agreements with the federal government around funding that embracing of the targets. And there are provinces that are a little slower in recognizing the opportunity that I think biodiversity conservation and climate change offers, not only in terms of the environmental and kind of values, ecological values related to that, but in fact, an opportunity in terms of shifting of economic models and centering conservation within a new, better made in Canada model of economics. So how can the Biodiversity Action Plan and legislation support greater participation and action in provinces which erect obstacles and are slow to progress on those federal targets? Allison.
Yeah, I'll try to start the conversation here. I think, I mean, I'm building on my last comment. I think it is, there is a role for citizens to push their governments, but also there are levers and tools that the federal government has that are kind of tried and true in terms of the Canadian Federation. And money is one of them, and money not just directed at conservation, but directed at infrastructure, at many different areas of supporting provincial and territorial government actions. And I did note in the last budget that there was a whole lot of conditionality put on some of the climate tax credits and expectations that provinces and territories will contribute to these goals in order to be able to access this funding. And I think there is more that can be done in terms of taking advantage of the funding power of the federal government to insist and ensure that those recalcitrant, perhaps provincial and territorial governments who are slow to adopt this can actually be encouraged to and incented to get on board. And of course, there's also some legislative tools as well that have backstops that if, federal and provincial, like the Species at Risk Act, where if the federal, provincial, or if provincial and territorial governments don't do this on their own, then there is a backstop that can be used to encourage them to do more. And so just two examples, again, of so encouraging the federal government to use the full suite of tools it has at its disposal to encourage, incent, and in some cases insist that provinces and territories act. And I think there is more that can be done there as well.
Thank you, Allison. David.
I like what Allison said there. I completely agree with that. And one of the things that I think is useful in that discussion is an understanding that it's an economic transition in some cases. And that's fearful for small community, for businesses that are operating in some parts of the the country. And so acknowledging that economic transition and then supporting and funding and addressing that socioeconomic change is key to this. So I know Natural Resources Canada has some great programs that support that. Here in the provincial government of British Columbia, we approach land use planning with a core element of understanding socioeconomic impacts and making sure that folks are going into that transition eyes open. So I'd say key to this is making sure that problem, we don't shy away from it. Acknowledge that it is a socioeconomic transition that can be a good thing, that can be very positive, especially when it's a change, and to be addressing that head on with some transparency and funding and resources.
Thank you very much, David. I'm going to move on to the next question just to keep this conversation rolling. Increasing the level of ecological literacy across all levels of Canadian society is probably key to implementing a biodiversity strategy and communicating about solutions and trade-offs, which will unfortunately be inevitable. How do the panelists feel this should be done? And so I'm wondering if, Simon, you wouldn't mind jumping in on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks to the viewer that provided the question. Really good question. I think there's a couple of ways that we can address this. First off is that people need to have access to nature wherever they live, no matter their social status, where they are in the community. People need to be able to, as I say, get outdoors, get some fresh air, get some vitamin D, and slowly over time, people, as folks age, have a greater appreciation for the environment and the importance of nature to not only our health, but all of the plants and animals' health around us. I think groups like WWF Canada and some of my colleagues on the call also have an important role to play in providing materials that are curriculum linked and that are savvy. Right, the kids today are using this platform, this medium to communicate with one another, which for some of us is quite a departure from nature and being in person. But we need to figure out how social media interacts with the environment and what's the sort of messaging that we put out to people. And yeah, just a couple of initial thoughts, but really for me, it's about getting people outside and having that connection to nature and building that over time.
Thank you very much, Simon. Anyone else want to tackle that question about popular ecological literacy?
Just to reinforce the kind of curriculum-based work, I mean, our organization, one of our chapters, the Southern Alberta chapter, has a school kind of connected curriculum-based program that gets, tens of thousands of kids out into nature, but also is in the classroom educating about the basics. And I think both civil society, but also, education ministries, part of this whole of government approach is aligning education ministries with the goal of halting and reversing biodiversity loss and really engaging from the youngest ages. So there is that literacy, and that's a long-term objective, but it is a critical one.
Bill, maybe just to add very briefly, I mean, I fully agree with what Simon and Alistair said. And I mean, their organizations and others do phenomenal work in this area. I would say, and you can hear it in what's been said, that part of this is about kind of education and understanding, but a big piece of it is actually about values and the ways in which how we kind of approach our kind of educational project is about kind of instilling those values associated with nature conservation and where it fits with us as a Canadian society and as multiple societies. So I think that's within the confines of our continent and oceans. So I think thinking through how that how the diversity values we bring to this influence the kinds of decisions that are made is kind of a key aspect of moving this forward. So it's, I guess, a hearts and minds strategy.
Thank you very much, Dr. O'Day. And I agree about this values piece. this is often the basis for which we work at the ILI, and I speak about love often, and this work, in order to be motivated despite the kind of the doom and gloom and the eco and climate anxiety that many of us feel in doing this work, is to be reminded of the fact that we align in terms of values as people within this country, and that we do love our spaces. It's not an accident that many of the kind of iconic Canadian images are related to nature. Let's think about the Group of Seven. Let's think about our quarter. And I don't know about you, but I'd love for that quarter to represent reality into the future. And I love to eat caribou. And so I'm delighted that we're working together in the alignment of those values. I'm gonna ask a final question and before closing up this panel. And this is a question about seeming opposite pressures. There's a number of questions that we've received about, how can we implement species at risk while also controlling invasive spaces? How do we preserve biodiversity but also acknowledge other land uses, such as increasing for cities, towns, housing, and agriculture? How do we ensure that a carbon neutral economy, which will require shifts and new investments in infrastructures and those sorts of things, with the reconciling the kind of the urgent need of the protection on nature? So how, as Canadians, can we really face the complexity of these challenges and ensure that we come out as a country that hopefully can be an example to the world on how we do this right? So I'll turn it over to you. Complexities, dichotomies. Anybody want to jump in?
I'll start, Val. But boy, you're really picking with the hard ones to start and to finish here. I'd say, the way I approach my life and my day is acknowledging that we create the world. We've made it more complex, and we therefore need to get smarter and more collaborative. So don't be surprised if these problems seem unbelievable and complex. Don't be fearful of that. Acknowledge that this is really, really challenging work. And then celebrate the examples. So that's one thing that I'm keen on, is always celebrating the examples where successes have been achieved. And I know there's quite a few across the country, and those need to be identified, communicated, celebrated for the wins that they've achieved, the accomplishments, and the lessons that can be learned in other parts. So, a huge one here in British Columbia is the conservation of the Great Bear Rainforest, the development of an approach for ecosystem-based management in that case, which has now informed many other pieces of policy, legislation, regulation, and agreements. The most recent example coming out of Justice Burke's decision up in the northeast of the province here in BC, we've come to agreement with Blueberry River First Nations and established ecosystem-based management within that part of the province as well. Different ecosystem, different interests provincially and with the First Nations, but very similar foundations to what was put forward in the Great Bear Rainforest. So I take heart that is a great example of how that can be addressed and how it can be solved, and there's unbelievable value there. And I go into it eyes open. This is a huge problem. It's absolutely terrifying. Do not lose heart. Hold hands together and look at those examples where we can celebrate the successes.
Thank you, David. Simon?
Yeah, those were all really great comments, David, and thanks again for another difficult question to wrap up the first panel. But when David says celebrate the examples, my slightly different spin on that is demonstrate the possible. And I think really what we need to be doing is having conversations like this, but we very rapidly need to be moving to action on the ground. Because conversations are a good starting point. That's where we can build some relationship, but we really need to be acting on the ground for impact. And it's going to be difficult, and it's not going to be pretty all the time, but together we can solve this problem. We need to be able to iterate activities. We need to adapt and ultimately demonstrate our resilience and together, move forward to address the biodiversity crisis, but also, I guess, also the climate crisis. So bend the curve on both of those.
Thank you, Simon. And Dr. O'Day, I wonder if I could turn to you for our final quick comments on this question, particularly since the Department of Fisheries Oceans is consistently facing this kind of dichotomy between the needs of the commercial fishery and the interests of conservation of our oceans and fish-bearing systems. So what are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. So first, it's hard. And I think we have to start from the acknowledgement that it's hard and that getting to where we need to get requires really kind of intensive and thoughtful collaboration. But I think we should try and get past the notion that the different priorities are fundamentally at odds with each other. Often, if we kind of set out on the table what are our ultimate objectives, whether that's nature conservation or sustainable economic development, whatever else, if you actually line up what we're looking to achieve ultimately, you can often work back from there to where there is a synergy between what nature needs and what people need. And I think that's, without sounding Pollyanna-ish, I think there actually is a solution space there that we can find in many instances. It's not always perfect, but it's a mind frame that I think helps us get further faster than we can otherwise.
Right on. Well, I think in many ways, the theme that we've had for this panel is collaboration and doing what we need to do it right and in a made in Canada model. And with that, I'd like to thank you all as panelists for joining us for the very first panel of this symposium. And I'd love to turn it over to my colleague Martin to take it over.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Valérie, Simon, David, Niall, Allison. Thanks for sharing your views with us today, for taking the time to being here, being part of this important conversation. This was a fantastic panel. And yes, indeed, lots of very difficult questions to answer and to tackle. Now, before we move to a quick health break, just wanted to note we'll upload another question for you. We'd like to know which sector you're joining us or that you're with. Take a second to fill that up so that we get a sense on who's joining us today. Latest number I heard is that we're still above the 900 marks on Zoom and about 100 on YouTube. That's fantastic. Happy to see the excitement here. And then on this, we'll just take a 15-minute break and we're right on time. So we'll see you all again at 1:05 so that we can launch into our second panel of the day. So hope you have a few minutes to stretch your legs, grab a snack, and we'll see you in a bit. Thank you. Bonjour, welcome back. It's great to see now. We will be joined by the members of our second panel. I also thank you for providing responses to our latest poll. I just wonder, are we going to show that on the screen or moving? Yes. Okay, sectors. So really well represented from the federal family, provinces, territories, and stakeholders, civil society. That's great. So now I'll bring your attention to our next question. And it's in two parts, full 4 and 5. Excellent. In terms of areas of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that Canada should the areas that they should prioritize, and then so I encourage you to fill these questions. And now I see that we have all of our panelists, and then so now I'll turn to this panel that's about meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. I'd like to invite the moderator, Dr. Elena Bennett, to take this virtual floor. Dr. Bennett has an extensive history in working in environmental issues. She is a professor at McGill University, and among many accomplishments and roles that she has, Dr. Bennett is Canada's research chair in sustainability science. I look very much forward to this conversation. So now over to you, Dr. Bennett.
Thanks, Martin. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here. What a great start to the symposium we've had already. I really appreciated the opening and all of the opening speakers. So I want to welcome everyone back and welcome to the second panel at today's National Biodiversity Symposium. This panel is going to focus on meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. So as Martin mentioned, I'm Dr. Elena Bennett. Just for a little positionality, I am an immigrant to Canada. I am coming to you today from traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I'm a professor, as mentioned, at McGill in sustainability science. And a lot of my research and teaching focuses on the relationships between people and nature from an ecological or systems point of view. And a lot of my work right now is on how we can manage for benefits, multiple benefits that Canada's working landscapes like agricultural areas or forestry areas provide to people. I'll be the moderator for this second panel, and I'm really thrilled to be here, really excited to hear what our interesting panelists have to say. Because my work touches on these contributions that nature makes to people and how we can do things more sustainably, like how we can help ensure that nature provides us fresh air to breathe or clean water to drink or nutritious food to eat or places to recreate. Biodiversity is everywhere. How we use it sustainably, how we share its benefits equitably, not only among people and two-legged creatures, but also among the four-legged creatures is really important. Across Canada, whether we live in cities or small towns or remote communities, our health, our prosperity, the quality of our lives are really closely linked to nature. We know that a lot of important economic sectors like fisheries, agriculture, forestry, they all rely on well-functioning ecosystems. And at the same time, they create pressures on nature if they're not carefully managed. So the question for us today is really, how do we keep this biodiversity healthy? How do we meet the needs of a growing population now and into the future? We have some excellent panelists with us today. They're going to give us a wide range of perspectives. We're going to get private and non-governmental sector perspectives. We'll get Métis, municipal, and federal government perspectives. Like with the first panel this morning, I encourage the audience to send in questions via the Zoom chat. We're really looking forward to having a lively discussion with the panelists about how to manage these benefits from nature sustainably and equitably. So let me just first start by introducing the 5 panelists for the second panel on meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. I'm going to introduce them alphabetically, and that's the order in which they'll speak as well. So our first panelist is Miles Anderson. He's the land manager and cattle rancher from Anderson Ranch in Saskatchewan. Our second panelist is Dr. Peggy Backman. She's the Deputy Director General of Quality of Life, and responsible person for biodiversity for the City of Montreal. Our third panelist is Dr. Susanna Fuller, the Vice President of Operations and Projects at Oceans North in Halifax. Our fourth panelist is Glenn Hargrove, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Canadian Forest Service at Natural Resources Canada. And our fifth panelist is Jana Whale, Research Associate at the Canadian Climate Institute. I want to welcome all 5 panelists. Thank you very much for being here and participating with us today. I'm going to invite each of the panelists to speak in turn for 5 minutes to share their experiences on successes, challenges, lessons learned, and opportunities for advancing biodiversity conservation and sustainable use in Canada. So I'll invite our first speaker to the floor now. That's Miles Anderson. Miles, I'll hand it over to you.
That working now? I guess I was muted. Thanks. Anyway, thanks for the introduction, Elena. As she said, I'm in Saskatchewan. I operate a cattle ranch and somewhat more than 30,000 acres. We run like 800 cows, so we really don't. They're spread out quite a bit. And when I was in Montreal, I talked to folks there that explained the problems that they have in Europe with cattle and just in livestock in general. And we do not have the same intensity that they have. So what happens when we get into the world talks, we get chucked under the bus purely because of the animal on which we manage. And I don't know how we fix that. I think that we have to get folks to understand that what happens in Canada is maybe a little bit different than what happens in the rest of the world, and the problems that some of the rest of the world has is not the same problems that we have here, but they can be the same. So saying that, we have to put things in context when we're talking about individual species, which cattle are one of them, which in some ways they could say that they're replaced by them, even though they're different. They kind of do the same things, and there's things that we can do that to make them kind of make the same impact upon the rangelands. But my complete deal is that I think biodiversity provides resilience, and that resilience ensures that you have sustainability. And what that does is in the diverse plant structure that's within the native prairie ecosystem, that there is pretty much something growing all year round. Even in the dead of winter, there's plants, if depending on how cold the soil is, they might grow all year round. And there's things in place that nature has developed over the years to protect yourself from mistakes that people make. And when I'm saying that we've been around on the Great Plains of North America since the Great Plains existed, and just maybe using different animals, but the plants and the organisms that can dictate the populations of things that exist on it are still there. And there's poisonous species of plants that when there's too many animals, it takes them out. And so what we've done is we've decided that, okay, well, let's take out the native prairie and plant Eurasian grasses and stuff on there so that we can make the ecosystem or the stuff that we use, the plants that we use, to suit the animal instead of making the animals suit the plants. And so, you know, in our place, we've been here for like more than 100 years. And if you go back to, so that we're probably on our 30 or 40th generation of cattle. So within that time, they have, through the mother bring the knowledge in, like through the interuteral deal, that we have trained a set of animals that are getting closer to what maybe was there with the bison. I'm not saying they're the same, but we're getting closer. So they don't have the major die-offs that they had when they first come in, like in 06, when they had all the cattle died in southern Canada, and then again in the 30s. Our animals have got better purely because of the length of time and what can happen between the generations of animals. But one thing I do want to touch on is values. And what happens is when we transfer this land from native prairie to any other kind of agricultural practice, you actually increase the value of it. So what you've done is the easiest way to double your money is to go out there and convert the land into either cropland or even to tame pasture. And in doing so, I mean, the values goes up. But anyway, what I'm suggesting is that maybe we have to put a value on biodiversity. And if there's some way that we can actually measure, which we can now, the value of that. So, I mean, if they can do it with Bitcoins and create an economy around that, why can't we do that similar process within the values within nature? And I don't think that it has to be just on the prairie. I think it could be happening in other places as well. And it's just an idea that I put forward. But anyway, I've taken out about enough time. I'll look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Miles. Next, I'd like to invite Peggy. The mic is yours.
Thank you, Elena. Merci, Elena. Alors, tout d'abord, j'aimerais remercier le
First, I'd
gouvernement
like to thank the federal government for inviting us, Montreal, and all of the municipalities to participate in the designing of this action plan on biodiversity. Since the cities are on the first line to see the global loss of biodiversity and the habitats that are being directly affected. The health and quality of life of the urban population are directly connected to the presence of nature in urban environments, in particular in the current context with the heat waves and floods. These various crises cannot be separated and has to be solved together in protecting biodiversity, which is essential to address this crisis. And the municipalities in this context have to make sure that the communities and citizens are at the heart, at the core of any solutions that we are working on. In terms of regarding the role of city in the implementation of the Montreal Coming Accord, the responsibility goes to the parties, but the cities are acting in the free axis of the agreement. And in this panel, we're talking about the sharing of resources, sharing of benefits, and cities have levers to make sure that all efforts towards biodiversity will benefit all of the population and all populations. cities are active on the international level, in particular through the C40. Montreal is very active in all of the international exchanges between cities, and we have a lot to learn from one another. Also, local governments and cities have an essential role in determining biodiversity, because we are often named as having an important role in the health indicators, whether it's human, animal, or vegetal health. And how these health key factors are determined is through planning tools. So these are cities that are planning the use of the territory, the zoning. So this is part of the tools that we have to use and our role within protecting, when it comes to protecting biodiversity. So using the existing tools in a different way through the lens of biodiversity, and also in the implementation of urban infrastructures, for which we must review the way that we do things sometimes. We are acting a lot to raise awareness towards citizens with our different tools, and we're used to it because we are a proximity government with the citizens. So each of our action will have a direct or indirect impact on biodiversity, whereas it's through the management of water, climate changes, protected zones, air quality. These are examples of direct actions. And when it comes to Montreal in particular, Montreal is an archipelago with 300 smaller islands. It has a lot of aquatic and land areas. We also have big parks, Montreal Park, the gardens, the botanic gardens that was built on a former whereas it's the Frederick Bach Park, which was a dump that was converted into a biodiversity area. So we have all these concrete actions that we're relying on, but Montreal is also a city that has adopted various plans to foster biodiversity. In particular, its climate action plan, our nature and sports plan, and we have various regulations, bylaws in terms of environment that makes Montreal a leader in terms of environment. We have bylaws on the use of plastic, pesticides. We are developing new parks at different places in the city, and various ecological corridors. I'd like to highlight the fact that among the challenges of the COP15 and sharing benefits, two big elements. First, Montreal has adopted a strategy of reconciliation with Indigenous people. And in this strategy, the protection of natural species in Montreal has to be done based on the principle of the 7 generations borrowed from Indigenous people. And it has to happen in a constant dialogue with Indigenous governments. So it is an important foundation for us of all the work that has to be done in terms of biodiversity. Also, Montreal has adopted COP15, 15 actions with 59 other cities worldwide, 15 concrete actions that are connected to cities. And among these actions, one of the important components that is transversal to all these actions is to make sure that all of the populations benefit from the efforts for biodiversity in an equal way. So how are we going to make sure that this equity will happen? We make sure to always reach the most vulnerable populations on our territory, on our urban territory, and these vulnerable populations are the ones that are the most affected by the loss of biodiversity and its impacts. And we can see that in specific actions in specific neighborhoods. So we are developing a neighborhood-based approach to take into consideration the state of biodiversities in these neighborhoods, which can be very different from one place to another in Montreal. So to conclude, I'd like to invite us to work together in partnership with all the different levels of the government, and to tell you that Montreal is ready to participate as a full partner in the design of this action plan. We have the common challenge to integrate biodiversity in our government's frameworks at all levels of government, when we have the common challenge to mobilize, to engage all our citizens. And as a proximity government, we believe that cities have a very important role when it comes to engaging citizens. So we hope that consultation mechanisms and information sharing mechanisms are included in this action plan, as well as funding mechanisms for these concerted actions with recurring funding with a long-term vision. So
I don't know if I have time for a few words in English. In conclusion, there are many reasons for promoting the engagement of subnational government and cities in the implementation of the convention. Cities haven't waited. They have been very active in their own way, locally, in their backyard, and also internationally, together also to be recognized as key players to implement the 2030 GBF. The implementation and monitoring of the convention, the GBF, needs to involve all levels of government as an appropriate collaboration process. Cities are essential leaders in the fight against climate change, the protection of the biodiversity, and the adaptability of our territories. They already experience the impact of environmental issues. They understand the major challenges that lie ahead, as well as the solutions to be implemented. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peggy. Merci beaucoup, Peggy, from the Cité de Montréal. Now we will turn the floor over to Susanna Fuller from Oceans North.
Thank you. And first, thank you for the invitation to participate on this. I'm joining you from Halifax, from the unceded territory of Mi'kmaq. And it's really nice, I think, on this panel I watched this morning as well, just to see familiar faces, but talking about something that's more ambitious perhaps than we've been able to discuss in the past, and drawing a lot from the first panel just on the need for collaboration. So I will probably echo some of the same things, but try and also be a little bit original. So I'm here, I think, representing the ocean, or doing the best I can to represent the ocean. And it's one of the few places in Canadian waters and Inuit Nunangat where we continue to harvest wild protein for commercial trade. So we don't do that as much on land, and our fisheries underpin the economic foundations of our coastal provinces, Inuit territories, and so many Indigenous communities rely on marine and fresh waters for their food and cultural practices. I think when it comes to ocean and biodiversity and aquatic ecosystem protection, Canada has such an outsized role in the world. We have the longest coastline, we have 9,000 rivers, we have more than 2 million lakes. It's a huge, huge amount of water. And I think often it gets maybe forgotten because of how much work we need to do on land. But I'm hoping as this gets rolled out and created, that we really have a solid approach to how we incorporate water into that strategy. And I'm going to end this discussion, I think, with the idea that the cup is half full. But I was going to say we have a mountain to climb, but I think a better analogy probably in stormy waters to navigate. We have good foundations. Canada has done a significant amount of work in upgrading our laws and policies for ocean and freshwater conservation, and we're now kind of in full swing of implementing those. But we need to be, I think, a little bit more proactive. We've made some progress. Dr. O'Day mentioned in the first panel But the new Fisheries Act has an obligation to rebuild fish populations. That's huge, but we've only just started to have to do that in 2019. Progress has been made in protecting important marine spaces and deep sea habitats with sponges and corals. We've made huge progress in that in the last couple of decades. None of that would have happened without the collaboration of the fishing industry. But we have a ways to go. Canada has protected about 15% of our ocean, and we have another 10%. And usually the first, I guess, as in anything, the first bit is not as difficult as the last bit. And so I think there's some heavy lifting to be done, and also perhaps some fatigue, particularly on the part of the fishing industry, in working on conservation at the same time that we need to rebuild fish stocks at the same time that climate change is taking its toll. So I think in a word, I would be by somebody from the industry who has handle on what is needed to bring the people who work in coastal communities to the table. We aren't using the tools that we do. The modern in 2019 included a few things. One of those is establishing ecologically significant areas, which is quite particular to freshwater, and we haven't yet done any of that. So I think there's a lot of potential moving forward for some of our lakes and rivers and coastal systems. I think still figuring really make decisions based on is very political, and I think we're making progress on making decisions based on science of where the health of our fish populations have some more work to do there. And again, Dr. O'Day mentioned this, but on the white whales, there's only about 330 left because of lack of proactive conservation and really being aware of what was happening to the right whales and where they were going. We are now in a really precarious situation where we can't lose one more right whale. And it's meant that an incredible amount of money has had to be spent. Industries have had to move where they fish and where they ship. And, it's unclear whether or not that huge amount of effort is actually going to ensure that we bring back this population. So we kind of lurch from crisis to crisis sometimes in the marine ecosystem in particular. We still fish on targeted fisheries on species that are assessed by COSEWIC and may have a status as endangered or threatened, but those are still targeted commercial fisheries, and it's very difficult to rebuild those populations and decide not to list under the Species at Risk Act, which may offer new protections and it may not. So I think we're a bit stuck, particularly with very large fisheries collapses like northern cod, largest fisheries collapse in the world over 30 years ago. We have not restored that population. And it's still one of the largest groundfish fisheries in Canada. So I think the hardest are very hard, and sometimes we don't make them quick enough. Just another example of where I think we're not making decisions quickly enough when it comes to industrial impacts on marine species. There's been increased shipping activity in Eclipse Sound in the Arctic, and because of that increased shipping activity, the narwhal population, and I like to think of the narwhal as the only real unicorns on the planet, that population's got down by 80%. And that's because we have not properly routed ships, right? So if we knew in advance that when industrial activity is increasing, that biodiversity protection is the absolute foundation of that activity, we would have an opportunity to perhaps avoid things. I think going forward, this was said in the first as well, but the idea marine species and aquatic ecosystems need to be absolutely defended. And Minister Guilbeault did talk about the nature agreements with provinces. Right now, those nature agreements, as I understand it, don't include fisheries and oceans. They don't necessarily include the marine environment. They may not include freshwater ecosystems. So I think that we have an opportunity right now to make sure that the marine environment is included in those nature agreements. And it will be hard, but I think if we don't start out with that basis, it's hard to do it. I think the other is is language. We don't really talk about any other wild population as a stock, but we talk about fish as stocks, which are commodities usually. And so maybe changing our language and talking about fish as populations would be a step in the right direction. They become something much more real, I think, when it's a population. And that's just a simple thing, but we always talk about fish stocks when we're talking about fisheries. Again, just being more proactive and taking into account climate change. Already we're seeing species moving. We're seeing things like shrimp populations declining, and they will not come back because we're getting bottom heat waves in the ocean. What's really important about this is who fishes where matters. And we will have coastal communities that will have to fundamentally change what they're doing, but we aren't planning for that proactively. And because we aren't, it's much harder to engage those communities in really looking at biodiversity protection and what kind of transitions need to be made. I think much of Atlantic Canada is still reeling impacts of Hurricane Fiona. And then we react instead of being proactive. As we move forward on this strategy, we've got to think about restoring the bottom of our ecosystems. Things like mackerel and herring and capelin, they're the food for commercial fish stocks, for whales, for seabirds, critical for ocean carbon storage. They are at historically low levels. We have never seen them so low as they are today. So, but we know if we stop fishing these species, they will come back. So some of that is making hard decisions for a longer time period so that we make sure that that population is recovering. On the positive side, we have the first ecosystem reference point for capelin that takes into account how much cod might need to eat of that capelin stock. We've never before considered the amount of prey that is needed for something higher up on the food chain. We're just going to have to carefully manage our marine spaces. Made in marine spatial planning, we're seeing increases in shipping, huge demand for offshore wind. As we kind of transition from the fossil fuel industry, I think we need to make sure that we're not trading that greenhouse gas emissions reduction for biodiversity destruction, and that we're really clear that protecting biodiversity is key part to those new industries. And yeah, maybe I'll just end with without a at least healthy and resilient ecosystem, we won't be able to adapt to the challenges that are ahead. We won't be able to adapt properly to climate change. Our communities will not be able to adapt economically. And so we have to do this together. Everybody has to see that they have a part in it. They also have to see that it's better to get engaged now rather than it being imposed. And I think there's a little bit of fear around that. I think we don't see biodiversity talked about a lot in fisheries advisory committee meetings, for example. And I think that language needs to start to come into those discussions. So there's less fear and much more engagement and collaboration from the people who ultimately hard decisions will impact.
Thank you so much, Susanna. That's wonderful. And just in the interest of time, we need to move to our next panelist, Glenn Hargrove. Over to you.
Thanks, Elena. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Very happy to be here alongside all the panelists today. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I am joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'd also just like to extend my thoughts to folks in Western Canada who are dealing with a very intense start to the wildfire season right now. So I'll try and be relatively brief. I'll just start by saying science is really at the core of the work that we do at the Canadian Forest Service, supporting resilient forests and a sector that's in transition. And as has been mentioned many times, we're facing a dual crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change, which we know is a global and local challenge that we must tackle together. And that's kind of a theme that I'm hearing across the speakers. So just to speak a bit about the work that we do in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, provinces, territories, and other stakeholders, the Canadian Forest Service science programs contribute to a wide range of values. So those include conservation, restoration, sustainable management, all of which are important to ensure that Canada's forest ecosystems remain resilient and productive, both now and for future generations. So maybe I'll just share a few examples. the Canadian Forest Service research teams have been measuring, for example, soil biodiversity to assess the sustainability of forest management practices. And this information will be used to help inform and support policies on sustainable forest management. We also undertake research focused on disturbance ecology and forest biodiversity, examining the history of disturbances and their impact on biodiversity, including species at risk. So this work helps to inform planning and policy development within the federal government, as well as opportunities to mitigate future impacts on forest ecosystems through changing forest management practices. The CFS is also a key partner in a long-term landscape level forest research project in Canada's boreal forest. So the ecosystem-based management emulating natural disturbances project in Alberta started in 1998, and that's provided new scientific knowledge to inform forest management practices and improve sector operational practices. You've also, I'm sure, heard quite a bit about the 2 Billion Trees program. I'd just like to speak to that a little bit as well. So as many of you know, in 2021, the Government of Canada launched the 2 Billion Trees program, which aims to grow our national forest cover and regenerate forest ecosystems. So we know trees are one of the most effective allies we have in the fight against climate change, and they also support important habitats and biodiversity, as well as valuable ecosystem services like water and air purification. And as Susanna mentioned, you know, these are twin outcomes. We can't sort of pit biodiversity against climate. We need to find solutions that address both crises. So as of March of this year, the 2 Billion Trees program is signed or is in the process of signing agreements to support organizations and governments in planting 260 million trees over 10 years. We've signed agreements in principle with 7 provinces and territories, and those help to lay out the objectives for the program and achieve joint investments in further projects. So this collaborative work is expected to directly contribute to progress on several targets of the GBF. And Peggy spoke earlier to the role of nature in urban settings. And we know that tree cover has positive health effects and that access to treed areas and green space is not always equitable. So the 2 Billion Trees program has a specific urban stream as well, which earmarks 500 million for urban tree planting. And we made significant progress in that area, including signed commitments to plant approximately 3 million trees already. Recognizing that successful ecosystem restoration and biodiversity protection is also rooted in braiding Indigenous knowledge with Western science, we will continue to work closely with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners to reach our shared goals. So one example of this is the CFS has launched the Indigenous Seed Collection Program through the National Tree Seed Center, and that was launched in March of 2022. With a goal to support Indigenous-led seed collections focused on species that are of cultural, medicinal, spiritual, and economic importance to each community. So since the launch, the program has provided 44 communities with in-person seed collection training and delivered over 250,000 seeds to Indigenous organizations. The Indigenous Forestry Initiative is another good example that supports Indigenous-led projects and Indigenous forest stewardship. So we're seeing positive impacts in communities and forest ecosystems through that program as well. And finally, I'd just like to talk about, you know, there's been talk as well about sort of the long-term economic sustainability of resource-based economies, and so I'd just like to talk a bit about getting the most value possible from our forests in a sustainable way. And part of that, I think, is ensuring that we're maximizing the value per cubic meter harvested in Canada. And so really focusing on a forest bioeconomy approach, making sure that we're deriving the most value from those trees that are harvested, making sure, of course, that the trees are harvested in the most sustainable way possible, and that forest management plans obviously take into account biodiversity objectives and critical habitat and that sort of thing. But we also need to make sure that when we harvest the tree that we're maximizing its value, and that way we know that when there are increased pressures on the land base and the timber that is harvestable over time, that we're ensuring that we're both increasing protection of habitat and contributing to climate change goals, and also ensuring economic benefits to forest-based communities. So In summary, I'd just say that halting and reversing biodiversity loss requires a global shift that needs to consider the environmental, social, and economic needs of us and our planet, and that the GBF is an important step along the way. So I look forward to continuing the work together on these issues. Thank you. Merci.
Merci. Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate that. And finally, our last panelist for this session. Our last panelist for the session is Jana Whale. Let me turn it over to you, Jana.
Thank you so much. Simtigat, Tigadam Hanak, Gakabol Jessa, Mahilu, Jana Wae, Gitsan, Gidamak Nii, Tanse, Jana Whale, Dishnikashon, Gidamak, Gitsan, Lakipna, Wikin, Mr. High Spiritwood, Meadow Lake, Montami, Shinakasu, Charette, and Arcand. So my name is Jana Whale, and I'm from Gittimak First Nation on my dad's side, and I'm also Cree Métis and Mixed European on my mother's side. I am calling in today from unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Gitxsan people in Gittimak First Nation, BC. So I wanted to start by telling you about who I am and who my family is, because Indigenous communities, who you are and who your family are, and how you connect to the land are very important for informing the knowledge that you hold. So for us, sharing this information is equally as important as sharing the current positions that I hold with the Canadian Climate Institute, working on the adaptation team, and also the fact that I'm here speaking on behalf of the Métis National Council. So merci for having me and inviting me here. So thinking about the theme of the panel about sustainable use and benefit sharing, I think it's important to recognize that we will not have sustainability or biodiversity if we do not have reciprocity. So when we're thinking about benefit sharing, it's important to think about benefit sharing with each other, but it's also important to think about how benefit shared with the land as well. So in terms of how we are able to give back to the land, and the land is able then to support us. So the decisions that we make and the policies that are selected all influence how we're able to distribute those benefits, not just amongst ourselves, but how those benefits are able to be either taken or given back to the land, since all benefits come from the land itself. So in order to truly have sustainable use, we therefore have to have the opportunity to have, in order to have benefit sharing, the land needs to be a fully functioning ecosystem once again. So from where we stand now in the climate crisis, and really surrounded by the associated impacts of climate change, we need to start to restore the land to the diverse state that we had before, or to a place that is more able to be resilient to the coming climate future. And what I mean by that is when a disaster does come through, a fire or a flood or whatever else we may experience, we need to go back in and manage with balance in mind. So I'll share a teaching with you that I received when I was out harvesting huckleberries a couple of years ago, which was when you are picking huckleberries, you do not want to over-harvest any huckleberry plant. You always need to leave a few for those who may come behind you and for other animals that need huckleberries in order to survive. So in turn, the reciprocity that you're showing that huckleberry plant will then enrich the rest of the ecosystems. There will be more for everybody that comes through behind you. Similarly, we need to restore biodiversity, so then there's enough on the land left for animals and plants, give them time to adapt to climate change and allow them to help us into the future. On the more human side of things, in order to understand where we're going, it's important to understand how we got here. So even without the pressure of climate change, colonialism in Canada has established a spectrum of access from communities that have to communities that have not. When we think about experiences of vulnerable or equity deserving communities in Canada and their accesses to things like goods and services, lands, resources, and how they're able to participate in building biodiversity, I think we can all agree that in the past, we have not seen equitable outcomes and that we have not seen benefit sharing for those who need it most. So I'm sure some of you have heard the statistic that Indigenous people protect 80% of the planet's biodiversity, despite being only around 5% of the global population. In my experience, Indigenous people want to be involved in governance. They want to be seen as right holders and partners as we continue on this journey to build back biodiversity. More and more, we are being looked at as for solutions and ideas, and it is important that we are seen as full partners and as leaders in the building back of biodiversity. So with that, yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. I know we're short on time, but thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jana, and thanks to all of our panelists. We have just a minute or two. So let me see if I can ask one quick question here, and that is that I think we've heard a lot about the role of individuals, about the role of cities, NGOs, different communities that we're part of. I wonder if we could ask or answer the question about the role of regulation. What is regulation doing now relative to what's needed, and how can we use regulation to pivot not just to reacting to problems, but actually to proactively managing our resources to support all of us equitably, including different groups of people and including supporting the land itself. Maybe if I turn it back to you first, Jana, and we just have a minute or two.
Okay, I'll do my best to be brief. So when I hear that question, I think the first thing I think about is the biodiversity as a policy choice. Essentially, when we're looking at different regulations and different policy options and what we can implement, there's going to be choices and trade-offs between what we want to see on the landscape and what maybe we want to see in the economy, and who we want to include or who we are not going to have time to include. So in terms of managing the best for biodiversity, that's going to have to be a prioritization by everybody, really. We're going to have to look to Indigenous people, we're going to have to look to our governments, we're going to have to look to NGOs to continue to prioritize that over other things. And that's going to mean we're going to have that trade-off. But in order to have effective regulations for biodiversity, that is going to have to be up there on the list of things that we want to see achieved. And it's going to have to be one of the things that we really work towards together and collaboratively. And I'll leave it for the next panel.
Wonderful. I have one other panelist who wants to take this on with about 30 to 60 seconds on the role of regulation. And pivoting to a proactive rather than reactive response. Okay.
I'll save you, Elena. So I mean, I guess what I would say is in the forest context, about 90% of Canada's forests are publicly owned land. And so protecting and conserving forest ecosystem health and diversity is a shared responsibility between the provinces, with the provinces and territories, as is a commitment toward sustainable forest management Canada-wide. So I think, you know, part of it is that we really need to work closely with the provinces and the territories, as well as Indigenous governments, to have a real pan-Canadian approach and to ensure that we're looking at these things in a proactive way. And regulation certainly is one of the tools in the toolkit among several, but can certainly play an important role.
Wonderful. Thanks, Glenn. And let me just thank all of the panelists. This was a really interesting session. I can say I started off by saying I'm an immigrant to Canada. As an immigrant, it's really a wonderful thing to see sessions like this at which people have a chance to listen and ask questions about what's going on, and hear about how individuals, government, NGO, all these different factors are playing together to try to protect Canada's biodiversity and all of the contributions that nature makes to people. Thank you all very much for being here for the second panel.
Yeah, and thanks to you for facilitating this this panel. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Peggy. Merci. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Jenna, for taking the time this afternoon to talk to us, share with us your knowledge, your wisdom. It feels like this panel went by so quickly, and it's unfortunate that we didn't have more time for Q&As. But your insights were very valuable to certainly to our work going forward. Je me demande si nous pouvons également mettre les résultats.
Myself, can we put the results of the last question of the last poll on the screen so that we can see what did we learn, what did we hear in terms of priority?
Mais ça vous donne une idée en fait de des opinions que nous avons à travers le pays. Et maintenant, je vais inviter également les gens qui nous supportent au niveau technique d'afficher la prochaine question dans laquelle on demande lesquels des domaines, dans quel domaine, en fait, on a fait beaucoup de progrès. J'entendais un panéliste plutôt parler de succès, what are our successes? Alors, je vous invite à regarder la question et à y répondre. Et puis, that brings me to, I see we have all the panelists for our next, our next one. Sans plus attendre, c'est avec un grand plaisir que
It's with great pleasure I'm inviting Dr. Mark Diorio to MC on our third panelist from environment. Dr. Diorio is ADM at ECC Canada. Dr. Diorio, to you, over to you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank everybody for being part of the symposium. The discussion up to now have been very interesting. So I'm joining you from Gatineau, Quebec, was part of the non-ceded territory of Algonquin.
Symposium. It is an important first step in this broad engagement with respect to the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was signed last year and is a major step for biodiversity on this planet. I'm very happy to be your moderator today. Les deux derniers panels ont fait état des nombreux...
I've presented several threats to biodiversity and the challenges we are facing to protect it and to restore it. Amongst those challenges, there are governance challenges. What do we do to reach our target to protect biodiversity?
Panels focusing on tools and solutions. Our speakers will share their thoughts and experience on how we can mainstream biodiversity concerns through a whole of government and indeed a whole of society approach to things. So I'd encourage all of us to reflect on the main things we've learned so far and heard so far, and understanding the conditions for success, and where we can draw on promising examples or best practices that we've had that can help in building capacity, in mobilizing people and resources, in looking at how we get best available information to decision makers in a clear and transparent way. So going back to first principle, biodiversity is this intricate web of life and of its habitats. And it's an essential, providing essential ecosystem services to us to sustain life on the planet. So it comes with its challenges, like, for example, how do we value nature? It comes with its webs of policies and practices, web of decision makers through levels of government and through civil society. So we have quite a challenge in front of us. So for everyone participating here, I'll encourage you to bring your questions and present them through the Zoom window. So we have 4 panelists joining us here today, and they represent youth, they represent non-governmental organizations, they represent First Nations, and they represent the private sector. So again, a very good cross-section of the many people that need to be engaged in order to deliver on the Global Biodiversity Framework. I'll present our 4 speakers, and then after that, I'll turn to our first one to start with their opening thoughts. So our first panelist will be Don Carr, Director at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Our second panelist will be Eli Ennis, co-founder and president and CEO of Isaac Olam Foundation. Our third panelist is Emily Gribben, a community coordinator at Canada Youth Biodiversity Network. And our fourth panelist will be Kate Lindsay, Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at the Forest Products Association of Canada. So thank you, panelists, for joining us here today. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. So first, I'll turn to Don for her opening remarks.
Okay, good afternoon. Bonjour à tous, and thank you, Dr. Delorio, for your opening remarks. It's a pleasure to join you today from my hometown of Peterborough, Ontario, which is on the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations. And from my heart, it's really important for me to begin this way and honor with gratitude Indigenous peoples everywhere, past and present, who are the original guardians of the lands, which we are really grateful to share, and who call upon us to be better stewards today and tomorrow. I'm sure my wonderful colleague and friend, Eli Enns, will speak more about this relationship shortly. And I also want to thank Elder Irene for opening this symposium in a good way. The first 20 years of my career, which sounds like a long time, was spent working within and for federal, provincial, and territorial governments that delivered biodiversity outcomes through publicly managed parks and protected areas. And much of my work for several years was dedicated to implementing Canada Target 1, which is the predecessor to the new and more ambitious target of protecting and conserving 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030. During that time, I grew an appreciation for the interdependencies and respect needed within communities, cultures, generations, sectors, and different levels of government. Now, since joining the Nature Conservancy of Canada in 2021 and its incredible team of conservation champions, my understanding of whole of government and whole of society has profoundly deepened. Now, given what I've come to know, I want to focus on 3 actions that need to occur within this national biodiversity strategy process this year if we are collectively to achieve success. Now, the first is to daylight the doers. For all those who aren't urban planners, the concept of daylighting is transforming cities by opening up culverts to reveal hidden rivers, waterways that were once the beating hearts of activity, beauty, and economy. For every target, there is a community of doers. We need to daylight them, acknowledge that they exist, and commit to governance and implementation processes that enable and make way for their important contributions. Collectively knowing who contributes is essential for effective collaboration, delivery, measurement, and celebration. Now, here's a specific example of where this is needed. For Target 3, 30 by 30, which we've heard about, we need to make the invisible network visible. The Nature Conservancy of Canada is one of the largest private land conservation organizations in the country, though we're not the only one. As a privately protected area organization, we're a recognized governance authority complemented by Indigenous peoples and local communities and governance. To this day, the provincial percentage of lands governed by NCC that count toward Target 3 range from 100% to 0%. Most provinces fall somewhere in between. Now, the disparity in how durable conservation is acknowledged across the country that's governed by the same national organization, somewhat astonishing. So how can we make smart decisions about land use and monitor and report on biodiversity conservation when right now we can't see what's being managed for conservation forever on a map? So we need to make the invisible network visible by daylighting the doers, and we need to do this for every target. Now, the second action that I'd like to mention is to mainstream a new mindset. Last year, I participated on the Canadian delegation in Geneva in the lead up to COP15. Now, during that meeting, I attended every biodiversity strategy learning session. I was keenly interested in implementation guidance from the get-go. International experts from around the world use the following consistent language: from ambitious science-based targets to successful implementation. Language matters. Implementation must now transition from language that speaks only of ambition to language that reflects the minimum requirement agreed upon for each target. They're now the floor, not the ceiling, as I heard Minister Guilbeault say this morning. Examples of this kind of big thinking mindset already exist. Look up the Quebec Ecological Corridor Initiative, which takes a whole of society approach to land use planning in Quebec, while collaborating with cross-border initiatives to scale impact within Canada and the United States. Our colleagues in Quebec are thinking big qualitatively to achieve quantitative results at scale. Third, and this is critical, we must really detail how we fully activate intra and intersector collaboration to implement the vision of a nature positive future. This requires engagement now with those not in this virtual space. I started this talk by highlighting that my understanding of whole of society profoundly deepened since joining NCC. I now experience and see the power of private sector partnerships and how they're changing the nature of solutions. NCC is working with more and more companies every day to help them meet their biodiversity and climate targets by harnessing the value of nature-based solutions with measurable project outcomes. Evidence abounds to why this is so important. Last month, finance analysts estimated that a 20-fold rise in biodiversity-related investments to more than $400 billion will occur by 2030. Why is this? Because investors see the need to manage risk. More than half of the world's economic output, $44 trillion, is modestly or highly dependent on nature, according to the World Economic Forum. And many international experts expect that the biodiversity agenda will ultimately leapfrog climate change. There is a tsunami of change on the way, and it's a good thing. All we need to do is we need to all make sure that we engage the business and finance sectors, especially if they too are seeking innovative nature-based solutions to what's been termed the Great Reset. Now, as a final thought, mainstreaming biodiversity together with other sectors, that wording in particular, was a huge priority identified throughout the many years of negotiation, and this carried on to COP15. This symposium and what's to come is a huge opportunity. It's really exciting to rekindle collective action. And I want to thank Minister Guilbeault and the Government of Canada for launching Canada's 4th NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, in a good way with all of us today. Success truly demands new approaches for unlocking all of our collective potential. And I know NCC and our colleagues throughout civil society are ready to act. And we need to act today as if our life depends on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Don, for these very thoughtful comments. So Eli, the floor is yours.
Okay, I started my 5-minute timer. My name's Eli Enns. I'm from Tlaoquiit, Nuu-chah-nulth Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island here. I'm joining you from the Wasanich Peoples Territories, Lands and Waters on Victoria, British Columbia. Thank you to Grandmother Irene for opening us up, and Minister Guilbeault and for hosting, and for all the organizers. So for practical tools, instead of talking about the origin story of Canada, I'll share with you, some of you may know I was the co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts for the Pathway to Canada Target 1. Don mentioned earlier, this was the sort of precursor to the 25 by 25 and 30 by 30. And in our report, which kind of defined IPCAs and offered IPCAs as really a social innovation at the end of the day, not only to help Canada to achieve its commitments to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, but ultimately to give life to the quote from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which is that reconciliation between Crown and Indigenous peoples can never truly happen until there's reconciliation with the land. And this is what the elder societies, the Indigenous nations right across Canada have been guiding us, have been saying collectively since early contact, since the earliest peace and friendship treaties that founded this country that we know today as Canada, which of course is the Haudenosaunee word Kanata, meaning village. And in that report of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, there was the Four Moose narrative that was highlighted. And in that narrative, one of the Four Moose was capacity development. And essentially what we're recognizing here is that it's really important to have excuse the term, but a big hairy goal. I know some people use that term more than others, but it's good to have ambitions, and it's good to, and you know, I commend the federal government and certain provinces for taking some leadership in funding the creation of new protected and conserved areas. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what our elders had said throughout the process, and what I believe really to the core of my being, is that it's not enough just to achieve spatial target outcomes. We need to take the time to build capacity so that we don't end up with stranded assets or even worse, damage relationships that are already precarious. The recent and ongoing discovery of mass graves has really brought home the reality of not just cultural, but genocide, full-blown genocide that's happened in this country. It continues to happen in different ways, and we need to be careful not to damage those precarious relationships further. So my point here is a big hairy goal with a lot of money behind it is great, but we want to make sure we don't damage those precarious relationships or end up with stranded assets. So my nonprofit, Indigenous-led organization called the Isak Olam Foundation really focused in on that capacity development side. So knowledge mobilization and capacity development. We partnered up with the Vancouver Island University to create an advanced IPCA planning certificate. We have founded during the pandemic Canada's first IPCA innovation program, innovation center, sorry, on the west coast of Canada, the Pacific IPCA Innovation Center. Last year, we launched the IPCA Knowledge Basket in partnership with the University of Guelph and ILI, of course. And all of these tools are designed to help compress as much as possible the innovation arc necessary to achieve spatial outcomes, but achieve those spatial outcomes in a good way. So that my seconds are running away here, but I'll conclude by saying, whoop, whoop, whoop. It actually makes a sound when you finish. I'll conclude by saying that, yes, I think financial investment's important. I think capacity development is equally important. Real jurisdictional solutions, sincere jurisdictional solutions where multiple levels of government can collaborate within a watershed for our collective well-being for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to come. Thank you. I know we're tough on time right now, so I'll stop there and look forward to the question and answer period.
Thank you, Eli. And thank you. It's a very important context and good things to focus on as well. So our next speaker will be Emily. Emily, I will give you the floor, and maybe I'll just start by saying that, you know, often when we talk to youth, people tend to say, well, no, you're the future. I'd like to say you're also the present, and a lot of great initiatives come from our youth. So I give you the floor.
Thank you, Mark, for that intro. So yeah, my name is Emily Gribben, and it's a pleasure being here today representing the Canadian Youth Biodiversity Network, which I'll refer to as CYBN for the rest of the panel. So we are a chapter of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which represents the official youth voice within the CBD. And as a Canadian chapter, we offer a platform for youth to engage and advocate for biodiversity conservation in decision-making. from the local to the international level. And one of our biggest accomplishments, I'd say, in the last 2 years is running. Oh, sorry, there's feedback. One of our biggest accomplishments in the last. Do others hear that, or okay? I think it's gone. Sorry. Was running a national youth conservation. So in 2021, over 2 days, we got youth together from across the country to understand what their priorities were when it comes to protecting nature, understanding what living in harmony with nature means to them, and put together a position that we sent to our politicians. The organization also participated in COP15. We co-hosted the official youth summit that took place ahead of the COP. And just as kind of an aside, I think COP was a really great opportunity for youth in Canada. One, just to raise awareness on biodiversity issues from all the media and social media attention that it got, and also connecting our climate and biodiversity communities in Canada. So for my time today, I know I've already gone through some of it, but I'd like to make 3 recommendations based on priorities that we heard in the national youth consultations, as well as some feedback from the Youth Summit, and kind of talk about how those can translate into our 2030 national strategy. So the first one is transformative education. We hear youth calling for this all the time. So I think youth place a lot of value on education as a means of changing perceptions and behavior. So we'd like to see more investment into curriculum change, as well informal as well as informal education systems. And when I say transformative, what I mean is, well, whenever we talk about transformative, it's always about system change. So going beyond just reforming curriculum within environmental sciences to figuring out how we can weave biodiversity and environmental considerations throughout all different subject matters. Another call from youth is always an equitable and just transition to a green economy. So I think how that can play out in our strategy is really focusing on the grassroots level, giving community-led and youth-led organizations the agency to make decisions. When I've talked to youth, one of the major barriers we face is really funding. So I think having defined ways of being able to finance and mobilize resources for youth-led initiatives would be very valuable to see in the strategy. Also included in this bucket is a focus on green jobs and conservation jobs for youth. Just from experience, our entire organization is all volunteer-based, and that really eats away at the capacity we have to deliver on projects. And there's no lack of ideas in our youth group. It's really the capacity, because we're doing this outside of our 9-to-5 jobs. So having more opportunities for youth to do this all day long, I think would be so valuable. And then the third point, and my last one, is on intergenerational equity and the full and effective participation of youth as equal partners in decision making, and really defining in our strategy how we're going to make this happen. And then quickly, as a final thought, which is more of a personal one, but I think if we want to see a successful biodiversity strategy, we really need a paradigm shift, which panelists before me have been talking about, in the way we view our relationship with nature, and being able to connect people with nature where they're at. And I think a lot of people live in cities these days. And so what we're doing with SIBN is we're in a transition period now from a national model to shifting towards a focus on local hubs where we can raise capacity within cities and communities, and be able to create impact on the ground where we live. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very, very good thoughts and suggestions, very concrete. At this point now, our last panelist for your introductory comments, I'll turn the floor over to Kate.
Thank you, Mark. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. As mentioned, my name is Kate Lindsay. I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at the Forest Products Association of Canada, or FPAC. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you virtually today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. Also want to extend a thank you to Grandmother Irene and the Minister, as well as so many people working behind the scenes at ECCC for so far a very interesting and successful symposium. Appreciate the opportunity to join my fellow panelists as well today. It was a real learning opportunity for me to be part of the Pathway to Target 1 initiative. As Alison Woodley mentioned at the beginning, and Eli as well, it was a really interesting process, and I learned a lot around progress towards the Aichi targets, and look forward to continued progress towards this new global biodiversity framework. Also was really fortunate to be part of the Canadian delegation, both for COP27 in Egypt, as well as COP15 in Montreal, and continue to actively work as part of Canada's relatively recent Nature Advisory Committee. And so just before I get started, I wanted to offer just a very high level observation, and maybe someone that I've worked in the private sector for most of my career. I've also worked for government, and I've worked for the forest products industry for quite a long time. And so when we come to conversations around conservation of biodiversity, I will say that at times I've felt like we're not part of the conversation, or we're not necessarily recognized as contributing. And part of that is language, and part of it is terminology. And so I've been really grateful, as mentioned, through the Pathway Initiative and Eli and Danica with the Indigenous Circle of Experts, for a lot of learning opportunities around recognizing different ways of knowing and the inclusion of different knowledge systems moving forward. And then also, when I take back to my own sector, is that there's an opportunity for cross-sectoral translation. So words like stewardship and how they can contribute to biodiversity conservation moving forward. So when we look at the topic at hand, which is frameworks and tools to implement and mainstream conservation, I'll speak to 4 frameworks that are quite prevalent in forestry in Canada. And I'll start, so it's laws and regulations and policy, market-driven instruments. The third is local partnerships, and the fourth is sustainable finance, and this movement towards ESG frameworks. And so when it comes to laws and regs, I'll go back to the Rio Earth Summit, which is in 1992, a really pivotal moment globally. Obviously, the convention itself came out of Rio, but so did the forestry principles. So this was a commitment by nations globally to halt deforestation. And although it did not become a convention, the forestry principles were significant. And Canada at that time later became a signatory to what is known as the Montreal Process. So this is countries that manage forests in boreal and temperate forest agreed to a set of criteria and indicators, and committed to report and monitor on those criteria and indicators. And criterion 1 is the conservation of biodiversity. And so it's been embedded in the Montreal Process for 2 decades at least. And it's also then in turn, because of the percentage of public land in Canada, was embedded in provincial forestry laws. And so it's foundational to the development of a forest management plan. And of course, laws and regulations need to be monitored or modernized and evolve over time. The second one is market-driven instruments. So actually the following year after Rio, a group that is now known as the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, met in Toronto in 1993 and saw an opportunity to develop a market-based instrument to ensure that customers could take comfort that the forests being managed for the products that they purchased were not leading to deforestation. And so that was another way and tool in which biodiversity conservation became part of that third-party audited standard. And following FSC, there's been a number of other certification standards. The other major one is PEFC globally. And then when I talk about local partnerships, because conservation is local, is is that relationship that's happening and evolving on the ground. And so the increase in co-management and Indigenous-led management of tenure is increased and continues to increase in Canada, as well as local partnerships with conservation organizations, and a bit of a shout out to Ducks Unlimited Canada and NCC, which have really been instrumental to informing sustainable forest management across Canada. And then the last instrument or framework I'll speak to is this emerging sustainable finance tools. So we know that sustainability has been kind of an expectation as far as corporate social responsibility, sustainability reportings, but now there's movement around understanding any organization or business's reliance on nature, and around the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, so TCND. I sit on the forum, and so it's something that we're very much following. As well, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has a nature positive roadmap for the forest sector. So those are just a couple of instruments being developed to ensure that conservation of biodiversity is being embedded into decisions in the forest product sector globally moving forward. So I'll stop there, Mark, and look forward to some time for discussion.
All right, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists on this. We've had several questions come in. I think the first one, and I think each panelist should find a way to address this, and maybe we'll ask Emily and then Eli, and then we can ask Don and then Kate. It's about disinformation. More and more we see disinformation in all areas, but with respect to biodiversity, there's an increasing amount of disinformation. How do you see we should deal with disinformation, and what's our role, and what's the role of the communities that you represent in trying to address this challenge? So Emily, do you want to give this one a shot?
Sure, I can kick it off. I think with disinformation, we're going to find it everywhere and in any different sector on any issue. But I think what's important is to try and amplify the right information. And I think it's helping invest in organizations that are doing so, and making sure that information is accessible to, well, from a youth perspective anyways, making sure that the information is accessible for youth as well. I know at SIBN, we've been working on different channels of communication, like putting together a podcast. We also have a blog series and different ways to communicate from trusted sources where youth know that they can get the right information. Maybe I'll pass it on now to one of the other panelists.
Eli, what's your take on this?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question because I've been struggling since last year or so. The storms that happened in Abbotsford and wiped out a bunch of infrastructure, even the fires. And my heart is also with the people in Northern Alberta and Northwest Territories that are dealing with such a big early fire season. But to just and the biggest one is the collapse of the Great Central Plains of North America. And that was all driven by human actions. And obviously climate change is a major factor, but it's an oversimplification just to blame climate change for these big storms and wildfires. The indigenous peoples who used fire technology to avoid large-scale forest fires, the economy of the bison and the bison grass, the native grass species that held the soil and the water during periods of drought in the Great Central Plains, the Sturgeon Lake at Abbotsford that has been drained for 100 years by science and technology for agriculture. If we want to be serious about finding the right solutions, we have to really understand the problem more. And it's a scapegoat just to say that we can blame climate change for all these storms and fires. What we've done is we've undermined the governance and the economic practices of the Indigenous peoples of those areas, which had evolved over thousands of years. And so, yeah, I think there is a lot of disinformation flying around, and we should always triangulate and do our own research. So yeah, anyways, thanks for the question.
No, thank you. Don, thoughts on this?
I think part of avoiding disinformation and making sure we're spreading evidence that's accurate is in part to look at all sources of all different kinds of sources rather than just like pick up on headlines. I know as an organization like NCC, we're really embedding that as a guiding principle in the way that we do our work, evidence-based research, both different ways of knowing. So it is along the lines of collaboration. It's like reaching out and understanding the diversity of perspectives that are out there and honing in on really what is the truth behind the headlines, behind the story, and start to spread the information which is truly grounded in evidence so that we start spreading information which is accurate, which will propel the kind of action we need to see.
Thank you. Kate?
I won't add too much, but it's something that we definitely face in the forest product sector. And I think we need to rely on good information. And Glenn Hargrove spoke before about science being a basis and experimental design. So where there's long-term studies of how the environment responds to different types of forest management and different types of disturbance such as fire and pest, that we understand and we're learning, and that's informing how we manage moving forward. But then I also think that there's a long way to go in reestablishing some lost trust. As Eli mentioned, cultural burning was such an important part of managing landscapes, and that was essentially removed through colonialism in Canada. And so anyway, all that to say is there's a lot of information and trust building that can take place through collaboration and being more inclusive moving forward and how we work together collaboratively.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
Now, Kate, there's several questions coming in, really asking about first FPAC's support to the Coding Montreal framework, and then thinking about, are market-based instruments effective? Do we need to review and revise definitions of sustainability? Some of them are fairly dated and perhaps not as robust as they ought to be. Just wondering what your thoughts were on that, and what are the, as in your role as a Chief Sustainability Officer for FPAC, what do you make of this with respect to this framework and how we go forward together on this?
Thank you. It's a really good question. So there have been evolution to the criteria and indicators, both when they've been embedded into laws, but also into the market-based instruments. So each of the certification standards go through a standard revision process, which is very inclusive, and they're on different timeframes, but largely every 5 years. And so we do see, for instance, SFI is a standard. This latest round of revision, they included climate smart forestry. So to better respond to the market's interest in how forests can be managed to understand vulnerability of climate change and what actions they can take to increase the resilience of Canada's forests. All the forest certification standards in Canada have made reference to UNDRIP. And so that's an important modernization, obviously. And then I also saw a question there around deforestation was the impetus to both the forestry principles and certification. But there is a growing need to address forest degradation as well. And so we did see it at COP26. Canada signed on to the Glasgow Declaration, which is to ensure that commodities are not driving deforestation or land degradation moving forward. So we are encouraging Canada to come up with an evidence-based definition of forest degradation. Currently, there's not one that's been agreed to globally, but we know that Canada is in the process of doing that. And we think that will be important to ensure that ongoing and improved sustainable forest management is not leading to land degradation. Thanks, Mark.
All right, thanks. There's an interesting question about how governments, industry, NGOs work and encourage Indigenous doers in this field. So maybe, Don, I'll start with you, but Eli, just to prepare you, I'm going to ask you your perspective because, you know, certain people want to encourage this is great, but what do you think is required in this space? So I'll start first with Don. I'll ask you your thoughts on this.
My tendency is always wanting to defer to a colleague like Eli to answer this question first, but and I think that's part of my response. Actually, I think my response is to you know, when we are working on the land, it's to seek out that information and to ask our colleagues that work in Indigenous communities and leadership to help inform the way forward. So, you know, I may actually feel more comfortable responding after Eli has an opportunity to shed light on this question. But go ahead, Eli.
Thanks, Don. Well, I guess maybe if I can say something insightful on this is UNDRIP is great. You know, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and free, prior, and informed consent is important. But I've always struggled with FPIC in particular because I think that it is high time that we move, and you know, there's every community, every nation is at a different point in this, but we're not just the victims of climate change. We're not the victims of genocide. We're not only the victims here. We also have a lot of solutions, and rather than placing ourselves in a passive role of either consenting or not consenting, you know, we're kind of working backwards a little bit in this country. One is, you know, the Haida Taiku court cases in 2004-5, which required consultation. In the absence of treaties that crown governments have a legal and moral obligation to consult and accommodate nations within their homelands and waters. And then we went from consultation to consent. But I don't think consent really is the proper landing either, because it still puts us in a passive role where we're either consenting or not consenting to some external actor's desires to do with our lands and waters. Now, whether that's an industrial project or whether that's a park and protected area, that we're now in a position, there is a whole lot of capacity within Indigenous Canada that we need to be in the driver's seat. We need to create a vision for what we want in our lands and waters, and then invite allies. We don't need settlers anymore. We don't need to settle anything. We don't need to settle the land any further. We need allies to work in good faith, in collaboration. And so I think that really, and you know, what I have found time and time again when I'm talking to leaders and elders and experts across Canada, what people are asking for, what Indigenous nations and communities are asking for is quite reasonable. We don't want, I don't know, I mean, maybe there are some out there, but I haven't met a lot who are like, well, I want to be a millionaire or a billionaire. I want to make, you know, go on expensive cruise yachts around the world, and these kinds of materialistic goals and indicators of success and well-being. What I have heard is quite modest desires, and often almost always connected to what's in the best interest of, you know, the generations coming 300, 500 years from now. So that's my little rant on this question. Back over to you, Donnie.
I think I would only close to say I really liked some of the earlier comments in the panel where it's just about the connecting the heart and mind and coming to these things with gratitude and humility. I love that about being an ally in these situations to, you know, really understand, like, how can nature be the solution to sort of the objective or outcome we'd all need to see. So I think coming to the table in good faith is really the way forward. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. Listen, I'm getting the virtual hook here to get off the stage. So I want to, premièrement, j'aimerais remercier tous les panélistes d'avoir participé aujourd'hui.
To thank all the panelists. It's a conversation that we could have gone on for many hours. There are many questions we didn't get to reply to.
Indeed, could have continued this for quite a while. And so thank you all panelists. You did a great job. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you.
Oui, merci, Marc. Thank you, Don, Eli, Emily, and Kate for sharing your views this afternoon. It was a very interesting panel, and you're right, Mark, that I think we could have gone for much longer. So now I'll invite the team to post the results from our last question to get a sense of the views of our participants in terms of what you think Canada is already making noticeable progress on. Give us a good sense on what are the views out there, and then I would invite again the team to post our next and last polling question, and this one is about for successful strategy, what key features should be included. So go ahead and tell us what you think. So now I'd like to welcome back Tara Shannon, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Canadian Wildlife Service at Environment and Climate Change Canada, to provide us with some final thoughts before the end of our symposium. À toi, Tara.
Merci, Martin, and thank you to all of the panelists and to those of you who have joined us today. I have been participating in the background throughout the entire session, and I'm really struck by how many people have joined us today. We were up at over 900 earlier on, and now we're still up over 700. So that to me is a real testimony to the importance that you are placing on addressing biodiversity loss and helping us advance our work towards the development of the action plan. So to me today is a real, I get the real sense of a strong start to our journey. And I wanted to just, I've been taking some notes throughout in terms of where I see some of the themes, and the panelists, each panel has, I think, spoken to some of these, but for me, some of what I've written down is, I think it was a colleague from British Columbia at the beginning of the day who said, it's not like this is about going together, not just going fast. I think the saying is go fast, go alone, but no, go fast and together. Clearly, the importance of Indigenous peoples and governments to addressing biodiversity loss. I think just reflecting on the framework itself, and I think it was the minister who said this early in the day, which is one of the key successes of the framework was, and I think what Canada brought to the negotiations in December was ensuring that there is a specific target that is focused on the inclusion and the leadership of Indigenous peoples in the framework, in the goals and the targets, and just addressing biodiversity writ large. So clearly a theme of partnerships and collaboration. And I think, transition, I was reading all of the Q's and A's throughout the day, and there were some very good Q's and A's, questions in there. So thank you. A lot for us to digest as we think about our next steps here. But transition is
is clearly on people's minds, and that's really helpful. Transition from the perspective of how do we properly value biodiversity. I saw a number of questions in terms of how do we mobilize, include the private sector. So very thoughtful questions. Thank you again. So I won't speak much more here. There's a lot I could say. I think I want to just thank you again, and I encourage you to take time to read the discussion paper that was posted. There are some questions there. I encourage you to put in further comments through the online forum, and we will be really looking forward to advancing our work together. I will just say in closing that a whole of society approach is clearly needed for our success, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your Monday afternoon, and I will turn it back to you, Martin. And before I leave, I will say again, thank you very much, Elder Grandmother Irene. Really appreciate you joining us today in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Now I'd like to welcome back Grandmother Irene to the virtual podium for officially closing the symposium. Grandmother Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So we're going to close with what's called the traveling song. And with this song, we send back those ancestors back home to the spirit world. And so I'm going to do 4 honor beats, and we're going to travel around the medicine wheel again. And this is the heartbeat. And you can imagine your ancestors again. So coming through that eastern doorway, we ask Creator for new beginnings, especially with the work ahead of us. And in that southern direction again, we're going to pray for our youth. This time we're going to pray for the ones that are struggling, that are on the streets and trying to find their way home and back to their own homes and families and their communities. And behind me, you can see Makwa, our bear, with her little cub. So we need the support and the courage of that bear to put things into place and to make things happen. So let's thank the spirit of that bear for being with us. All right, this is our last round. So let's sing those beautiful ancestors home. You know who they are. hey ah, hey oh, hey ah, hey ah, hi oh, Chimiquetch, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Grandmother Irene, for your opening and closing. J'aimerais maintenant prendre une minute pour remercier.
A minute to thank everyone who's contributed to the success of this symposium. First of all, thank you to all the MCs and panelists. Thank you for everyone who prepared this event and the background. There were many, and thank you for our technical team who made that event happen virtually. Thank you for the general public, everyone who took part of the symposium.
The beginning with this kickoff. I'm looking forward to seeing the next chapter of our journey together to Hot Rivers Biodiversity Loss in Canada. And on this, I wish you all to have a wonderful day. Merci à tous. Bonne journée.